All right, get that closed up. Pull this up. And away we go. Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us once again for another episode of The Ken Show. My name is Corey DeVos, and I'm here today, as always, with Ken Wilber. Ken, how you doing, man?
Good, Brady. Good.
Oh, it's great to see you. And as always, I'm really excited for today's show. I feel like that's something I say with every show, but you know, we just keep on doing some amazing stuff together. Right. And today we're going to be talking about an ebook that we recently circulated on Integral Life. That's called Integral Politics, Its Essential Ingredients. And, you know, in this piece, which I thought was just extraordinary, it's something that I dug out of the kenwilber.com archives and kind of cleaned up a bit, and then, you know, thought we should recirculate it because it really does surface some really, I think, critical insights to help us make a bit more sense of this just political chaos that we're all so immersed in these days. And, you know, in this piece, you suggest basically 4 major scales and 5 minor scales. And I really appreciated your sort of musical metaphor here. I thought that was cool. But these scales really basically consist of, you know, the critical elements and polarities that basically influence and oftentimes determine our own political views and stances, our preferred political parties and so forth.
Right.
And, you know, before we get too far into the discussion, Ken, I feel like we should mention that, you know, today we're likely going to be focusing on the major political parties here in the United States. And, you know, United States politics occupies a different part of the political spectrum than we see in, say, Europe. These same scales, I think, can be applied universally around the world, however, regardless of, you know, these various systems of governance. In fact, I think you make a really good point that these different systems of governance are themselves generated by these polarities and these elements that you describe in this piece. So I think it's also important to mention that, you know, we don't want to oversimplify things here, right? So I think we need to mention that, you know, political parties are not these sort of static monolithic entities, especially in America, where, you know, we have this voting system that's called first past the post, which basically results in these really broad coalitions between, you know, any number of loosely aligned ideologies and interest groups and really mega donors. And, you know, each of these players are, you know, sort of engaged in this constant tug of war to exert the most influence within their parties. And you know, basically this is just sort of how politics in America in particular works. These political parties are social hold-ons. They're tremendously complex social hold-ons, especially at this scale. And that's exactly, I think, you know, one of the things I really appreciated about this ebook, Ken, is that it helps us get past a lot of the really, really overly simplistic narratives that I think are usually wrapped around our politics, where everything gets reduced basically, you know, like to a sports competition. It's just left versus right, red team versus blue team. And all of these critical elements that you're surfacing in, you know, in this ebook get just lost in this like ideological fervor. Because when, you know, I think when we look at these scales, when we look at, you know, really each of the major elections that we've had in the United States going back, you know, let's say just 20 years, you can really see how all of these elections basically pivoted around one of these polarities in particular. Right. You know, I've got something here. Let's see. Sometimes it's primarily a battle between interiorists and exteriorists. Sometimes it's a battle between individual rights and collective responsibilities, which is, I think, what we saw in the 2010 midterm after the rise of the Tea Party in reaction to the Affordable Care Act. Sometimes it's a battle between progression and regression, which I think was one of the main stories with the Trump-Clinton election, where it was basically like, you know, the progress, quote unquote, of neoliberal globalization versus sort of a return of you know, nationalistic politics and rhetoric. So, you know, each of these elections really does, you know, all of these scales are at play all the time, but it's almost like whenever we have a major election, one of them really, really comes to the forefront. Right. And that's, you know, again, this is why this piece is so important, because it gives us sort of an inventory of all of these polarities and drives and impulses. And and so forth.
Right.
You know, and it's yeah, I lost my train of thought, but all of which is to say, I'm really excited to have this conversation with you.
Right.
'Cause I think it's going to help us bring, you know, just a bit more sophistication and a bit more discernment, really, to our political conversations, regardless of how any of us might, you know, orient politically.
Right.
So, you know, my first question, Ken, is so as we mentioned at the beginning, this was excerpted from a larger piece that you were working on probably what, about, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, which was called at the time The Many Faces of Terrorism. Is that something that still exists? Is that something you're still
It
working on?
turned out to be a trilogy. And it just sort of kept growing, kept growing, kept growing. I had originally wrote it as literally a follow-up to the book Boomeritis.
Right.
And Boomeritis was an interesting project. The way that got started was I'd actually written this critique of postmodernism, but it included the positive aspects and the negative aspects. It included its true but partial truths, ways that it was adding new types of truths to our understanding, and then ways that, like every other stage of development, has its shadow elements, its downsides, areas that aren't working out the way they were intended to, and so on. And so it was good news, bad news kind of thing. But essentially, the whole feel of the book, as I read it, was just sort of negative. It was, you know, here's how this is ending up going wrong. Here's how this is going wrong. Here's how this is going wrong. And I just didn't like the feel of the book because I'd never really written a book that was just kind of that negative. I'd always basically, without not trying to be mindlessly optimistic or any of that, but I would just say, here are some real positive things that we can do. Here are areas of reality that we don't seem to be aware of, but they seem to be incredibly important to all aspects of our lives. So take a look at this, and so on. And so as I was reading Boomeritis, and it was really, I had about 4 days before I was due to turn it in. And late one night going through it, I just made the decision that I wasn't going to do that book. And so I sort of thought about it. And I had probably, it was also fairly kind of academic. I mean, I went through summaries and critiques of most postmodern philosophers, from Foucault to Derrida to Lyotard, Jacques Lacan, and so on. And pretty academically sluggish. And so I had probably one of the worst ideas that I've ever had, which was I would take all of that academic material and turn it into a novel. So, like, that's the way to make it really fun reading, right? You know, a novel about just this impenetrable postmodern kind of nonsense stuff. But I sort of worked on it, stretched it out, expanded the format, and then also primarily really just tried to make it a funny book, as odd as that sounds, because there was so much sort of criticism in it. And so it really was sort of a deliberate attempt to be witty, if that's even possible for somebody. But the general feedback I got on the book is that it was very funny, and people did like that part. But it went on through that, and I think has some really interesting, unique aspects to it. It particularly laid out 7 principles that a perfect postmodern production would have to have in order to include all the tenets of postmodernism. And so the great postmodern novel would have to include all of those tenets. And the last tenet was, if you included this, be sure to point out that you did all of this so you could take extra credit for, being a really special super person who had all of this self-reflexive self-consciousness. And then all 7 of the things in that list were things I actually did in the book. So I thought it was sort of successful on that level anyway. And then as I kept looking into these topics, they, of course, I continued to advance while I was thinking. And so I decided, well, I could write those new ideas in just sort of a standard, quote, academic kind of book. Mm-hmm. Or I could actually just go ahead and do a follow-up to Boomeritis. And I decided to go ahead and just do a follow-up. So I started, and the plot actually got fairly interesting. Had to do with the capacity to predict the future.
Yeah, it was a science fiction book, basically.
In a certain sense, it was, and it was based on the fact that most computer programs to date are truly horrible at predicting the future. And so we can even go back like about 2 years, feed in all the data that we had 2 years ago into one of these computer programs meant to tell us the future. We go back 2 years, run the program, and it can't even get the present correct. It messes it up. And so the point of this book was that once we had computer programs that actually took into account more truly important and influential areas in a human being, like the entire AQUIL framework, mm-hmm. that we would be able to have much more accurate prediction capacities. And the part of the plot of the book centers around the fact that this institution that was doing this work was set in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and it was deliberately called Integral Center because that was the plan, Integral Institute. Mm-hmm. And the protagonist of the novel is named Ken Wilber, keeping in line with one of the postmodern tenets that you have to be self-reflexive, and it's always about you. It's never about anything else. And the point was that the rumor had spread that Integral Center had had computer programs that were starting to predict the future with increasingly greater accuracy because it was based on, well, they would make programs that you could go back at first 2 years, feed in data, and then get the present predicted accurately. And then it could go back 5 years and do it and get the present accurately. And then 10, the farthest they've been able to go was about 30 years backward. And right when they got to 30 years, and then they did run that forward, there was some sort of horrifying catastrophe that occurred. And so the rumors were rife with what was that catastrophe, what had happened that was so horrifying. Eventually, you find out that its prediction is that there is a reduction in human life of over 50% in around 30 years from now, which is, of course, a disaster. There will be about 3.5 billion people dead. So the question was why? Mm-hmm. And that's part of the unfolding of the book along that line. And there are side trips into the creation of a World Federation, and it gets taken over initially by Green. Mm-hmm. And that ends up implementing policies that are absolutely catastrophic, even though enormously good-hearted and well-intentioned. And this is part of the problem of postmodernism itself, right, which is it's largely driven not just by the green stage of development, but by a broken green stage of development. And that's partly responsible for a lot of the problems we see now in today's world. So in the course of all of that, it just sort of kept expanding until I had 3 volumes.
Such a typical Ken Wilber story.
It is. I'm sorry to say. And each of them are about 500 pages. So these were big. And then I just ended up going on and doing other work that was also really pressing. And this just kind of got pushed to the back a bit. Also, something that had become that large and that bulky, actually going through it and getting everything to match up and make sure everything's consistent, all that really starts to become an enormous amount of work. And I really didn't have quite the amount of time I needed to give the attention that I would have to give that to actually bring it to its finished publishable form. So that kind of set on the side. But one of the things that it did include was just this general overall view of political theory that included a lot of these areas that are largely not really well known at all in our culture. So things like we would now call waking up, things like growing up, things like showing up, these are virtually unknown in today's culture, including college professors. Most college professors are unaware of all of those elements. So it's really kind of problematic. But just by going through some of the different variables that actually impact a person's political orientation, then we could at least start to look at our political systems, what we were trying to do, and then also importantly, what areas were we not included? What things did we need to be aware of to make better choices, to make the political system work better?
Right.
So that's what this was an initial attempt to simply outline some of those really, really important factors. And I thought what I'd do to get this started is, as usual, you have a great list of questions and reflection stuff that you put together, also based on questions that are being sent in, and then also your own questions. And so we usually read those and then I respond to them. So right before we start that, I thought I'd give just a really kind of brief introduction to show what's involved here.
Fantastic.
Right, yeah. And so I'm going to just take about 10 minutes and do that.
Beautiful.
And turn it over to you, and you can start going through the points and then the questions that you've outlined. What we're doing here really is working with major theories about politics. And what we find is that almost every, certainly political, every psychological model tends to come up with what it thinks constitutes the type of personality that we choose to be progressive versus the personality that we choose to be conservative. And they're trying to sort of identify what those factors are. And my point as we go through some of these is that there isn't really just one specific parameter that can decide what's left and what's right. That actually every element in a cosmic address exerts an influence on a person's political orientation. And so as we'll see as we go through this, the quadrants, the levels, lines, different states, different types will have an impact on your political orientation. Some of them turn out to be really prevalent and important. Others turn out to be less prevalent, less important, but they all have some recognizable role to play in our political process. So by taking these all into account and letting each individual figure out, okay, if that's the definition of left and right, then where do I fall in that? And then, okay, if this next definition of left and right, then where do I fall in that? And then when you're done, you're going to start to have a pretty good sense about how all the different types of theories that have been proposed to account for political orientations. You'll have a better sense of where you are in all of those. And also then we can also all start to draw some ideas about, well, how would this impact national or international politics if we actually start taking all these factors into account? Because they're all there and they're all having an important impact on this process. And so we need to at least be aware of that. So I gave you some examples of theories that already exist and have been proposed by very, very legitimate people. And you'll start to get a sense about what I mean in terms of these different theories trying to explain political orientation. So if we take one based on types, for example, and look at how types affect political orientation, probably the most widely accepted conventional model of psychology is called the Big Five factor analysis. And this is basically just a flat out statistical analysis of the types of personality, types of temperament that individuals have. So they basically just sort of put everybody on the table, did an analysis of all their temperament types, and then analyzed the ones to see which ones were constant and most important. And then once they had those, then they could take people that had those types of temperament and then test them to see what their proclivities were, what their motivations were, what their political orientation was, that type of thing. So the Big Five, through a statistical analysis, came up with the idea that there are 5 major types. And that's why it's called Big Five factor analysis. And these factors are summarized by the acronym OCEAN. So O for openness, C for conscientiousness, E is for extroversion, introversion, A is for agreeableness, and N is for negative emotions or neuroticism. And so with those factors, you then take people that are progressive and you see which of those temperaments they tend to express most. And then you take conservatives and see which of those temperaments they tend to express most. And what you find is that progressives are high on openness and low on conscientiousness. And openness does include things like creativity, and openness also implies being open to new ideas and wanting to improve things, that kind of thing. But conservatives are fairly low in openness, but they're high in conscientiousness, and particularly the subtype known as order. So according to the Big Five analysis, progressives are high in openness and conservatives high in order. So left, right, open, order makes a certain amount of sense. Mm-hmm. Jonathan Haidt, who's a very brilliant moral psychologist out of City University in New York, he refined this into around overall 5 different types. And what he found is that progressives tend to focus their moral decisions based on 2 principles. One is doing no harm to individuals, and that means no harm to everybody, basically. It's a world-centric orientation. And the second principle is fairness. treating all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And that's also a world-centric, universal, moral orientation.
Mm-hmm.
And then he found conservatives will use those two, but they also use three others that most progressives don't. And in fact, many progressives feel negatively about them.
Mm-hmm.
But they were in-group loyalty, respect for authority, and group sanctity or group purity. And what you see there is that where the first two, universally no harm and treating all people fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed, those are indeed world-centric. But these new principles, in-group loyalty, group sanctity, respect for authority in the group, those are more ethnocentric. Those are based on just your specific group. So there's a tension in that conservative orientation between world-centric and ethnocentric. And one of the questions that none of these major models answer is, how can you explain that difference? What was going on that allowed those different types of moral principles to emerge? And why do we see the higher ones in progressives and we don't see any of the ethnocentric ones in progressives, but we do see them in conservatives? Mm-hmm. So we'll come back to that, and I'll give what I think is a plausible explanation for that. Then you have Jonathan Peterson, and his take on left and right is that, first of all, hierarchies are absolutely mandatory for any sort of human organization. And he points out actually that if you look in the animal kingdom, hierarchies go back for hundreds of millions of years. Mm-hmm. They weren't invented by capitalism or patriarchy or anything like that. And in fact, what he's talking about is what we integralists refer to as growth hierarchies. And growth hierarchies are absolutely mandatory. Even the simple sequence, starting from the Big Bang and going to quarks, and then to atoms, and then to molecules, and then to cells, and then to organisms, that's a growth hierarchy. It's a hierarchy of increasing complexity, increasing unity, increasing wholeness, and increasing inclusivity. Each higher stage in the growth hierarchy becomes more inclusive, not less inclusive. So when you move from atoms to molecules, molecules don't oppress atoms. They don't hate atoms. They don't exclude atoms. If anything, they enfold them. They actually include them in their own makeup. If anything, they love them. They're embracing them. It's, so that's a very important sequence that we find in nature. And we find growth hierarchies in human developmental models all over the place. I mean, the at least dozen or so multiple intelligences that human beings have, those all grow and develop through growth hierarchies, sometimes called holarchies. So those are very important. And Peterson is acknowledging that, and he refers to them as hierarchies of competence. Mm. And that's mostly how a society will decide that it wants to pursue a particular goal. And whatever that goal happens to be, some people are more gifted at it or more talented at it than others. That's pretty much unavoidable. So once a society has set particular goals and particular aims, some people will be better at those than others, so that they'll rise up the hierarchy of competency. And so those are necessary and those are important. And people on the right tend to see that those are important. And those conservatives on the right, that's what they want to do. They want to conserve those hierarchies because they recognize they're absolutely crucial to societal functioning. But any hierarchy can become corrupt. Mm-hmm. Any hierarchy can increase inequality and unfairness. And that becomes what we call dominator hierarchies. And those are all the horrible things that the left says they are. But the left, for Peterson, makes a mistake of, well, as I would word this part of it, they confuse dominator and growth hierarchies. There's no difference for them. All hierarchies are dominator hierarchies for the left. Mm-hmm. So their approach to hierarchies is get rid of all of them. They're all bad, flatten all hierarchies. And so Peterson says, so these can both go too far, they can both be confused, but they're both working with a partial truth, which is conservatives want to conserve functioning hierarchies, mm-hmm. and the left, seeing the inequality and the corruption, just wants to tear them all down. So the left, at least until recently, where there was a bit of a switch, and we'll talk about that, supported the working class, for example, mm-hmm. because they were being downtrodden by these competence hierarchies. So for Peterson, ongoing dialogue between left and right is important because mm-hmm. they both have true but partial correct ideas. So both of those have to be included. And then there are also some upper right studies of brain physiology, and they claim to measure a difference between progressive brainwave patterns and conservative brainwave patterns. So that's another quadrant-based type of political differentiation. Mm-hmm. What all of these lack is an ability to, well, what they all lack is the developmental component, mm-hmm. which will allow us to see, for example, why there was this strange inversion in the 1960s when the original liberal left started to become illiberal, far left, green liberals. Mm-hmm. And so this was a big change. And it pointed out that what we call the left, which started with a liberal orientation, and about half of today's left has stayed with a liberal orientation. The progressive half, the leading edge components, have moved into green. And green actually doesn't like orange values. So it really doesn't like liberal values. It doesn't like free speech. It's perfectly glad to get rid of free speech in order to protect feelings of minorities. So it has a whole different priority system. And we'll talk about that when we get to altitude. Mm-hmm. So because of that, if we can bring in more of the actual elements that are impinging on a human being's awareness when they make political decisions, then we'll get a better sense about what's making up these different political orientations. So that's, in essence, what we want to talk about. And so with that, right, go ahead and turn it over to you, and we can start to go through some of these major and minor variables.
Yeah, awesome. Well, and as you were talking, Ken, and giving this sort of overview summary, I actually found a quote from Sex Ecology Spirituality that I think punctuates this nicely, and it's cool to see how consistent your observations have been over the decades. And, here you say, the liberal then looks at the typical traditional amber conservative values, which are ethnocentric, nationalistic, and jingoistic, but which are adaptive and unavoidable at that stage, yet can easily slide into homophobia and gay bashing, sexism and misogyny, militarism and imperialism. And the liberals say, If those are what we mean by instilling values, then I'm staying out of the values game altogether,
Right.
failing to see that its own world-centric fairness is simply the next stage in the next nested hierarchy or holarchy of unfolding values.
Right.
So I think that ties those sort of two pieces of your presentation together
Exactly.
Beautifully. So yeah, let's take a closer look at each of these major and minor scales.
Right.
And offer just some commentary here. And
Sure.
again, if anyone, the full ebook is available on Integral Life. You should be able to find it right now on the Integral Life homepage. So if you haven't already downloaded it and read it, you can do so after this call. But so let's start with the first major scale,
Right.
which, as you say, is interior versus exterior.
Right.
And we probably, Ken, we probably don't need to spend too much time in this because we've actually spent a lot of time talking about this in previous episodes.
Right.
But let's give a summary. And I think that this text actually gives a really powerful summary of this. But the basic idea is that when it comes to finding solutions for our social problems, the
Right.
left and the right tend to come at it from different angles.
Right.
The left points to exterior causes and the right points to interior causes.
Right.
And, again, you give some really great examples in this piece. Why are people poor? The Republicans will say because they're lazy, they lack work ethic, they lack family values, they have an entitlement mentality, etc. Democrats will say, well, because they're oppressed, because the playing field is not level, because there's wealth inequality, because there's a historic legacy of oppression, and so forth.
Right.
You also give the example of gun violence. What do we do about gun violence? The Republicans say it's not a gun problem, it's a people problem. We need to teach better morals and better respect for guns. And at the extreme end, they'll say give everyone a gun, including children at school.
Right.
Democrats will say, well, no, we need to create effective gun control policies. We need to selectively remove certain guns from circulation, or at the extreme end, we need to ban all guns. So it's, I think the distinction there is pretty clear. Now, sometimes, Ken, one of the things I've noticed is sometimes the wires do get a little bit crossed here. For example,
of course,
when it comes to gun violence, it's typically the Republicans who say things like, who actually often blame external factors like video games or violent movies or rap music or what have you. Right. But the case they're making is that these exterior causes are actually, having a coarsening effect on our morality and our values and our culture. So it still ultimately ends up being sort of interior causation there. And then I want to read briefly a paragraph from this ebook, because you give a whole slew of other, really powerful examples here.
Sure.
And so goes the interior-exterior raging debate about the cause of human suffering, from guns to poverty to abortions to unemployment, economic well-being. Republicans say, instill values of personal industry, work ethic, and free market capitalism, and those deserving will prosper. Democrats say, redistribute the wealth. Abortion, the Democrat says, abortion on demand. The Republican says, practice responsible sex and abstinence, and you won't need abortions in the first place. Homelessness, the Democrat says, make housing available to those who are disenfranchised. The Republican says, teach the values of self-responsibility in industry, and you won't have that many indigent. World hunger, Democrat says, feed the hungry. Republican says, teach them to feed themselves. In each case, the Republican mostly recommends interior changes, and the Democrat recommends exterior changes. And Ken, every step of the way, they're both fucking right. Yeah, I mean, that's sort of the point of an integral politics, yeah?
Absolutely, absolutely. One of the things that we find is that people are, particularly as their own growth, development, and evolution is occurring. Howard Gardner once defined human development as increasing development means decreasing narcissism. Mm. And that's a good way to look at it. Mm-hmm. As you decrease your own selfish, egocentric point of view, you end up taking wider and wider and wider and wider views. And that's one of the extraordinary things. It's just part of the actual directionality of the cosmos, which is it drives towards larger, more inclusive, more complex, more whole, mm-hmm. and more conscious holons. And we find the same thing in human beings. And so as we become more and more aware of these factors, at every point we're identified with whichever the factors that are in our awareness that have developed at that point. And if somebody attacks any of those, because we're identified with them, we experience it as an attack on ourselves, even a death threat. I mean, we experience it as a death seizure. I mean, if the ideas that I really believe in are attacked, I feel like they're attacking me personally. And so I can get really upset. So one of the things we want to do is expand a person's sense of moral embrace and moral capacity until it really does go from just one tribe with 30 or 40 people to a group of tribes to super tribes to all tribes, literally all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And that was a long, slow process.
Right.
It took us at least around 300,000 years just to get from tribal, me first, all the way up to a global village. And so, and it was only a couple 100 years ago that we even figured out, for example, that slavery was wrong.
Right.
Just a couple 100 years ago, out of 300,000, every major great world religion accepted slavery. Buddhist monasteries had slaves, Christian monasteries had slaves. Slavery was so widespread that even the American Indians took their slaves with them on the Trail of Tears. It was just unbelievable. But then roughly between around 1770 and 1870, slavery was outlawed from pretty much every major rational industrial country on the face of the planet. First time anything like that had occurred anywhere. And that was because we had developed to a point where we had gone from these ethnocentric moral stages to I'll treat somebody fairly who belongs to my group. But then other groups, I'm pretty suspicious of them. They're demonic or devilish or bad, and I have to watch out for them. But to finally get up to, wait, I care for all groups or all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed.
Mm-hmm.
That was a stunning achievement in human development and allowed the rise of everything from abolition movements to female rights movements, women's rights movements, to the freeing of the untouchables. I mean, it was just really a profound, profound transformation in human history. Mm-hmm. And part of the things that we have to watch out for right now is as we get highly polarized and we start to kind of re-tribalize, we're diving back under that world-centric atmosphere, back down into ethnocentric. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit more later, but that's turning out to be a staggeringly huge problem. Mm-hmm. A lot of really, really bad results.
Right.
And so that's an issue that we need to deal with. This particular interior and exterior was just a broad kind of view that I was using to identify the left and the right. And I actually first presented it in one of my earlier books called Up from Eden. But I did notice that several months after that book came out, Time magazine actually started using the terms interiorist and exteriorist to describe the right and the left. So I took that as a little bit of a victory.
Yeah.
And it is important, but there are other factors we have to take into account so we can continue and move through those.
Fantastic.
We're on individual and social, I think, individual and
cultural. Yeah, I think so. Let me find my place here. Yeah, the next scale, which, really, Ken, I think that, probably actually has as much influence on our political narratives as interior exterior is, in fact, individual versus collective. And this, this could translate on, Ayn Rand has a very famous political scale that is basically, left versus right on the x-axis. And what did she say? I think it's libertarian versus autonomy on the y-axis. Now, I think she sort of loaded her terms a little bit. Nobody looks at the word autonomy and goes, hey, that's, but, or autocracy, I should say. But, I think one maybe harmonic, to keep with the sort of musical metaphor, a harmonic of individual and collective might be something like freedom versus security, where security here can either mean military security, ultimately at the extreme, something like authoritarianism, or it can be social security, things like the social safety net. But it's always this, it's always presented as this conflict between these two rights, our social rights and our individual sort of libertarian rights. And this really seems to be, again, in the 2010 election, after we passed the Affordable Care Act, we had the rise of the Tea Party, which was, fully entrenched on one of these poles, which was, keep your government hands off my Medicare. And meanwhile, progressives were, genuinely thinking, hey, we can do a lot of social good here. We can fulfill sort of our obligation and our responsibility to the collective by, dispersing the medical risks here and growing the insurance pools. And that really, I think, zeroed in on, or at least brought into relief, this really fundamental fault line in American politics, which is in fact between the individual freedoms and the social responsibilities.
And one of the things that we find as you look at various political theories and also just various philosophical theories is there's always a tendency to argue in terms of things like individual and collective, as well as interior and exterior. They're almost always champions that just believe in only one of those and not in both of those. And so they'll end up sort of skewing their whole theory in order to account just for that element that they agree with. And then they put down sort of the whole element that they don't.
Right.
So if you take something like agency and communion, which is similar to individual and cultural, we'll talk about the differences when we get to agency and communion. They're not exactly the same. But the whole point about individual and social hold-ons is that these just happen to be two very extremely widespread, but clearly distinct different types of hold-ons. And they're often confused. So one of the most common things, for example, is to say that, okay, we have a hierarchy and it goes from atoms to molecules to cells to organisms and then up through animals, and then it gets to human, to a human being. And then the next highest level is the family. And then the next highest level is community. And the next highest level is like maybe an ecosystem. And then there's up into nationality, and then up into the entire biosphere, and then the entire planet. And then that's part of the entire solar system. And, and it's just that kind of, and what they haven't noticed is that they've made a break halfway up between individual hold-ons and social hold-ons or collective hold-ons. And those don't run in the same line. They're not talking about the same thing. But it's common for somebody thinking that way to say, for example, that human beings are all parts of a superorganism. That we're just all cells in a society which itself is a single superorganism, and therefore we're all parts of that organism. But there's a profound difference between individual and social hold-ons, and it's really, really important. Alfred North Whitehead pointed out one version of it, for example, and I've talked about this before, but just to put it very briefly, I always use my dog as an example, and an individual hold-on. And if my dog decides to get up and walk across the room, 100% of its atoms, molecules, cells get up and move with it. It's not a democracy. 50% of molecules don't decide to go one way and 50% decide to go the other way. When the dog walks, they all get up and go right with it. There's no question about it.
Yep.
No society has anything like that control over its members at all. And the reason, based on a generalization of Whitehead, is that the individual holon has what he called a dominant monad. And that's simply the monad that when it decides to get up and walk, all the other monads, all the other holons in it walk with it. But a social holon doesn't have a dominant monad. It has a dominant mode of discourse.
Right.
And that dominant mode of discourse includes a set of common values, a set of common principles and goals, purposes that the vast majority of members can agree on, and that's why they recognize themselves as part of that society. And so that's the difference between individual and collective. They always are correlated. Wherever you have any individual, anything, there's a group of that and what they look like. And that goes all the way back to the very earliest and smallest holons, all the way up to the present. Mm-hmm. So that's why we have 4 quadrants. Mm-hmm. And those are all crucially important. And so in the same way that we said the left-hand quadrants and the right-hand quadrants, when it comes to those in terms of distinguishing left and right approaches, with the right emphasizing interior causation and the left emphasizing exterior causation. The same is true of upper and lower. Those are also different, but they go together. Mm. And so one of the great perplexities of political theory in general is how do you take individual humans and have them interact in a social group where they have to give up some of their behavior in order to fit with the overall collective. And those kinds of compromises have to be made. So how do we do it? And 2 of the most common ways is to select just one of those and try to absolutely get rid of the other or minimize it enormously. So on this side, you have something like just a radical libertarian, which is we do whatever we want and the state can't tell us anything, sort of along that line. And then when it comes to the state, of course, then we have things that are more socialist and communist, and they say, no, what's important is the state. When fascism was first being created, and it was an offshoot of Marxism, and the statement was everything inside the state, nothing outside the state. So that was a pure lower quadrant collective dominance. Mm-hmm. And the answer is both of those taken on their own just aren't right. Because you really can't have individuals without collectives, and you can't have collectives without individuals. They really do go together, just like interiors and exteriors. And that's why all 4 of these quadrants are equally important. Mm. So the way that most modern democratic societies have worked out that dilemma, how do you have individuals fit with a group? How do you have them get along? Is that an individual will accept restrictions on their behavior. They'll be more likely to accept those restrictions if they have a hand in deciding what those restrictions will be. So if they can participate in that, and they all understand they're working together, and then they decide, okay, we will restrict the capacity to the number of cars that we can put in our garage, or whatever it is, whatever restrictions there. If you've had a hand in it, in other words, if you've had a chance to actually vote, for example, then you're going to be more willing to follow that. And that's essentially the basic principle that most of our modern democratic systems are based on. It seems to be one of the best ways to handle that dilemma right now. And that's, of course, Winston Churchill's famous quote about democracy was the worst system we have, except for all the others.
Right.
And that's about where we are right now. It doesn't mean that democracy in a sort of literalistic one body, one vote. That's not necessarily the best way to arrange a more progressive or even utopian society. And we'll get to some of the ways that that might happen when we get to questions that we have about what would be an ideal future if it was up to me. And we'll discuss some of those things with that.
Yeah.
But this is just another variable. It's clearly important. Humans come up with a wide spectrum that stretches between them, just like we have a wide spectrum between the interior and the exterior quadrants. And the central takeaway, though, is whatever you decide on those issues, make sure that you are including all four of those quadrants.
Right.
Anyone you leave out is categorically wrong. It's just not right. And so anything that is based on that brokenness is just going to be more brokenness. So don't do it.
Right. So. Yeah, and it's funny, Kenny. I think we especially see this this conflict between individuals and collective responsibilities. We see this particularly here in Colorado, where by state law, you know, Colorado is a really interesting place. We have a very interesting purple state where we have some really cool flavors of liberalism and some really interesting flavors of conservatism too. And, you know, sometimes they can actually get along and they can actually, you know, make new policy happen. Other times it just opens up this massive fault line between the two and there's no hope of building a bridge. So, you know, for example, when it comes to economic policy in the state, you know, here in Boulder County, it's often said that, you know, the liberals in Boulder have never, ever seen a tax increase that they didn't love. We're always voting for tax increases, right? Because we want to, you know, I think that the average Boulder liberal says, you know, I've got some wealth and I've got these values that are telling me that I need to, you know, support the society that I'm a part of. So yeah, raise my taxes, make me pay more. And then on the flip side of it, you know, Colorado also has this libertarian history that resulted in a law called Tabor that makes it illegal for the state to increase taxes without the entire state voting on it. Right. And what this has done, these two very, very different, you know, ideologies, two very different approaches have created this constant, you know, lockjam in our state politics.
Yeah.
You know, now some people might look at a situation like that and say, well, you know, that kind of deadlock is probably good for us in the long run because we're not swinging too far one way or the other. But other people like me who are looking at, you know, our you know, miserable school system in this state and you know, want more money to be put towards infrastructure because we have so many people moving into Colorado and our roads are getting dilapidated. And, you know, I want to see improvements here. It can get really frustrating because, you know, anytime you hold a tax increase subject to, you know, having to get voted on by an entire state, nothing's ever going to pass. No one's ever going to vote to increase their taxes. So it's interesting. We see these things not just on the sort of national level, but we see it on local levels as well. And it's cool that this element, sort of this polarity, gives us, you know, a little bit more granularity when we have these kinds of
conversations. And the one thing that, at the very least, the one thing that you want to get out of an integral approach is not to simply reach a position where there's deadlock because you just can't, you know, it doesn't appear that anything works. So you just shut down and don't even try to figure it out anymore. Mm-hmm. Those almost always come from some factors not being included in the overall consideration. And that's why it's jammed. It's not jammed because it's an inherently jammed situation. It's jammed because you don't have all of the parameters that are actually influencing it.
That's right.
So if you take a more integral approach to these problems, even if you don't immediately come up with a solution, you will start seeing, oh, wait, there are ways forward here. There are things that can be done. This doesn't have to be just a deadlock. And that's one of the really important things that we get out of Integral. And then, of course, as it continues to grow, then more and more solutions come out as well. Mm-hmm. But the first step is putting enough actually important variables on the table that there is, at least theoretically, the possibility of solutions. Yeah. Whereas if you're trying to cure AIDS and you don't know anything about the HIV virus, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
So Integral is just, okay, there's an HIV virus and there's a this virus and there's a this and there's a this. Make sure you include all of those and now see what happens.
Right.
That's the minimum we're trying to do, is to get that kind of openness in terms of possibilities at a minimum.
Yep. No, it's beautifully said. It's a funny thing about polarities. You kind of need both of them.
Well, that's the ultimate secret about the whole thing. Another item that comes in, it can come in several places, and we'll bring it up again several times, but it's just sort of the whole notion of an economic policy. Mm. And at some point that does include things like taxes, how much are appropriate, are they appropriate? And the basic idea, again, that we sort of worked out with a market economic system is that we want to be able to hitch individual initiative with economic activity. Mm. And that usually means some sort of free market, but one that isn't totally free.
Right.
Because a totally free market is pretty much lacks morals. And so we actually have to impose a certain number of moral constraints on the market to make it palatable, let alone moral. So among other things, for example, is there was a time when the market freely included selling human beings. And best product, best price, supply and demand, the whole thing. And nobody had any trouble with that. It's a free market. Nobody was, except human beings are being sold. I mean, it's horrifying. So at some point we said, okay, wait, that's not good. And so we actually make it against the law to do that kind of thing. And as our ongoing moral development increases, and that happens precisely because in our own evolutionary development, our identities get larger and larger and larger. And the more people, once we identify with somebody, then we'll treat them as a brother or sister. If we haven't, and there's that other over there, then we don't trust them. Mm. And so that's been the problem throughout history, is expanding this self-identity. And today, in virtually all developmental psychology models of development, they have at least these 4 very broad stages that go from egocentric, where my identity is just me, and what's right is what I say is right. And by the way, fuck you. And then that moves up and expands an identity into a whole group, a whole family, a whole tribe, the whole nation. And those are often referred to as ethnocentric. And that's an advance over egocentric, but it still doesn't embrace all groups. And so it extends morality to its own group, but not to other groups, alien groups, groups that are other. Then the next major stage is what Carol Gilligan, for example, referred to as universal care. Mm-hmm. And that means then you do care for all humans, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed. And so that's an expansion literally to a global identity, and realizing that everybody in that group which is all human beings, has equal rights and will be treated fairly. And that's, again, that's an extremely rare and relatively recent development, and it's incredibly important. And then most models have some sort of 4 stages that they'll refer to as systemic or integral or integrated. And they're simply stages that can take all of those previous stages into account and address them appropriately. So that's an important issue that we're facing. And we see the same thing in economics. One of the problems, and we'll talk about this a bit later, is that government can certainly do absolutely horrible things. And we'll talk about this when we get to what I call the regulator. Mm-hmm. But it also, particularly in the last couple hundred years, or particularly since a realization that something like slavery was wrong, mm-hmm. then governments have been called on to implement moral actions, at least in some areas. And the classic example of this is the Civil Rights Act of the 60s. In 1963, only 23% of the American population was in favor of civil rights. And so the government, and there's a lot of arguing about which side it was, Democrats, Republicans, and we can talk about that as well. But in any event, the government came in and said, wait, you can think whatever you want in the privacy of your home, but when you go out into the public sphere, you will behave as if everybody is to be treated equally, or we will arrest your ass. And that was something the government did. It wasn't something that came bottom up, so to speak. And so that's become the go-to for every left desire. When they do want to raise taxes, they always look back and say, well, see what the government did with civil rights. Well, we've got more of that we have to do. And if they're progressives, of course, which in some sense is good, that's part mm-hmm. of, we do want to include that. We also want to include conservative. But progressive is endless. We're always going to be progressing.
Right.
So there's always going to be something that has to be brought in. And then the things are already in, they become conservative. At least on one of the scales we'll talk about, transformation and translation. So these make a real role. And we did see the Democrats shift from being a little bit distrustful of government to putting almost all their hope in government. Mm-hmm. And so now they want, the government take care of this, take care of healthcare, take care of education, take care of it. Now that might be good. I'm not arguing that. I'm just saying the Civil Rights Act became the primary learning mechanism in our history where people said government necessary, government does good.
Yeah.
And of course, there's a lot of counter arguments to that, but that's the part of the argument that was always put forward positively. And it is something to consider. It's definitely something to consider. And again, we can talk a little bit more about that later. There's last thing I'll mention just very briefly about the economic situation. We'll come back to this and talk about globalization. But with the government being that part that at least can help introduce higher, more truly evolutionary, more truly inclusive, more truly developed values. Right now, government is confined to nation states. That's the fundamentally highest form of real government that we have. The market, on the other hand, with its free market, and then we try to curtail it with certain moral sanctions, no slavery, no trafficking, that kind of stuff. But otherwise, the market tends to be very competitive mm-hmm. and aggressive in that sense. And the problem is the market is now global. but governments are national.
Right.
And we don't have a balance there. And that's producing some disasters.
Mm-hmm.
Because we really don't have a government that can match the size of the market. And therefore, the government can oversee the market in very limited but important ways. And so we have, that's an issue. And so now we have nation states plunked in this global competitive free market. And anything that a nation state does that's going to like help the environment, but if it does so, it'll cost it hugely in terms of economic competitiveness. We have a market that's actually driving us into more and more externalities, more and more environmental destruction. And we don't have anything to counterbalance that. And that's a nightmare.
Yep.
So this is a real important issue that we have to keep in mind as we're thinking about ways to move forward integrally.
Yeah, Ken, I think that is such an incredibly important point, that when we have an economic system that really has in most ways gone transnational,
right?
And in the meanwhile, we have governing systems that have only made it up to national. In fact, for some of those countries, they're struggling even to get there.
Yeah.
That becomes a hotbed of oligarchy and plutocracy and wealth inequality, and all of these sort of exterior challenges that liberals rightfully point to as being some of the toughest and most insurmountable challenges of our time,
right?
Particularly when it comes to things like addressing climate change or any of these other transnational issues that we have that by definition cannot be addressed from any given nation state. And I've got, I've got a really great quote here. From Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. You say, the global nature of this transformation is now being driven, particularly in its technological economic base, by three interrelated factors. Number one, the necessity to protect the global commons, the common biosphere that belongs to no nation, no tribe, no creed, no race. Number two, the necessity to regulate the world financial system, which no longer responds to national borders. And number three, the necessity to maintain a modicum of international peace and security, which is now not so much a matter of major war between any two nations, but between a new order of loosely federated nations and renegade regimes threatening world peace. The point is that all three of those concerns no longer respond to actions taken merely on the part of individual nations.
Right.
Not one of those problems can be solved on a national level. They are literally transnational crises demanding transnational world-centric responses. And exactly how to negotiate this difficult transition with nations voluntarily surrendering some of their sovereignty for the global betterment, therein precisely is the extremely difficult nature of this post-national global transition.
Absolutely. And part of that problem, again, is that it really is a four-quadrant problem, because we can't just have a handful of governments that are dedicated towards truly world-centric, universally moral, even integral positions, when 60 to 70% of the population itself is at ethnocentric or lower stages of development. I mean, the vast majority of the world's population, every time they make love, they're producing little Nazis. And this is like, rah! Even Robert Keegan, using his developmental model and checking large samples of American citizens, finds that 3 out of 5 of them, 60%, don't make it to orange, modern, world-centric stages. That means they're ethnocentric or lower.
Yep.
And that is scary.
Yep.
And we'll come back to that as well when we get to altitude.
Yep.
Because that's one of probably the single most important issues that we have to deal with in politics. And it's not being addressed. It's being politicized and weaponized, both sides.
Yep.
And that is a disaster of the first magnitude. So we'll come back to that problem. The last thing I would say, just very quickly, in terms of looking at some of these global economic problems, is that a strange or increasingly sort of strange, mostly just meaning radically new types of economies are tending to emerge. And of course, this has happened with every previous major transformative stage in the past, where whether you're going from foraging to horticultural to agrarian to industrial to informational and now to more advanced informational, and you might even call it augmented human stages with artificial intelligence and so on. And one of the things that's starting to take place, well, there's sort of two aspects that immediately come into play. But one is the balkanization due to social media and people getting in the so-called echo chambers and just reinforcing each other and becoming less and less capable of having actual dialogue, which is nightmarish. On the other hand, we have this strange phenomena that tends to happen with major businesses that are operating primarily on the web. And that's something that's often referred to as sort of a winner take all. Because what tends to happen is you get online, and let's say there are 10, car dealerships, and everybody keeps trying, they keep going to this one, they go into that one, and they give feedback. Usually on websites, they'll say, well, I went to so-and-so Motors, and they're idiots. They didn't know what they were talking about. They had the worst prices I've seen in town. And so, they start getting scores and feedback, and people know about them. And so if you're going to buy a car and you go to a website that has all 10 of the major cars and they have all the feedback from customers, and you find one that just stands out, exquisitely, then you're going to go to that one. There's no reason you're going to say, oh, let me find the shittiest one here. And oh, I'll go to that one. So all of a sudden you get an Amazon and it starts doing that. And then pretty soon Amazon has eaten everything in its vicinity and it's just in essence a monopoly. You have Google. It does that. Pretty soon it eats everything. It's a monopoly. And the problem, of course, is that these are all private companies. So we really can't do something like civil rights movement with them because they're not government. And at least so far, private companies essentially have the right to do pretty much what they want to within limits. And so that's the problem that we're facing. Mm-hmm. Nobody ever really saw that one coming. But what we're seeing is less and less and less competition, even while certain small startups can get started. But if they start to do well, then they'll start to take over as well.
Yep.
And then you get another winner takes all. So this is a problem, particularly since they are private companies and they can institute any sort of bias, prejudice, bigoted policies that they want, as long as they don't really step on some sort of federal process and then they get called on the mat for that. So that's a real issue. And we really have to think about that. And one of the solutions, of course, is that we get more people at the higher stages of moral development that have less and less bigoted and prejudiced views that they want to implement, thinking that they're doing a good thing. Mm-hmm. And so we'll come back to that as we continue to talk about things that can be done.
Great. Great. Awesome. No, thank you for that. That was it was very well said. So yeah, the next major scale. And this is one that, Ken, I find particularly interesting. It's the transformation versus translation polarity, which, also oftentimes translates to progressive versus conservative, or even, as you say, eros versus agape.
Right.
And one of the reasons it's so interesting to me is that it's so multidimensional. For example, and this is a good opportunity for me to try to identify my own sort of political biases. Right. I consider myself an integral independent, right, who typically labels himself. I typically label myself a progressive, largely because I want to see in my lifetime new integral systems come into being that do not currently exist. However, my progressivism, the way I relate to my progressivism, I consider it a progressivism that actually includes a healthy conservatism at its core. What I don't want to do is take a wrecking ball, right, to everything. Right. I don't want to flatten all the growth hierarchies. I think it's probably a good thing that we have something like an FBI. I think it's a good thing that we have, mainstream media outlets out there, as sort of problematic as they often are. I'm not someone, again, who wants to completely, just sort of destroy the structures that we've inherited for the sake of creating something new. But right. I do want to create something new.
Right.
Because I think that we, as human beings and as a human society, actually have some opportunities right now that we've never had before in the history of civilization itself. And I want to see those possibilities and potentials actualized in my lifetime, and if not in my lifetime, in my daughter's lifetime. So that's where my sort of streak of progressivism comes from. And, I think another interesting thing, it seems like with this scale in particular, there is a very wide spectrum of skillful means when it comes to this particular polarity. Because, for example, oftentimes the most integral choice is not for the most integral candidate or even the most integral policy. It's actually for the candidate or policy that's capable of doing the most good for the most number of people while still being able to be selected for by the rest of culture and society. That is, and that is where my conservatism comes in. I'm not going to be too bold in my choices, knowing that my preferences and my priorities are just not going to get selected by the rest of culture. So I try to choose my battles, find those incremental paths to progress where I can. And then when we have an opportunity for sort of, one of those punctuated equilibrium kind of leaps into something new, hey, let's take that leap.
Right.
But this polarity, I think, really gets down to, what do you want to see emerge in the world, and what do you want to see preserved in this world?
And this actually wasn't much of a political choice in humankind's history until really the Western Enlightenment. Because what we found with the Western Enlightenment is that there really was the emergence of, at least on a relatively wide scale, at least 10% of the population had reached these stages that were generally referred to as things like formal operational cognition or rationality. The Durants call it the age of reason. And it really did mark a bit of a shift in terms of our cognitive development. For most of the previous stages, at least on a collective scale, were mythic or mythic literal or concrete operational thinking and so on. And so your primary belief system, for example, if you were a European in the Middle Ages, your primary belief system was essentially Christian. And your values were oriented around that. And you were, if you talked about values you had as a Christian versus values that you didn't have if you weren't, then if you were a Christian, then you have a chance of being saved eternally. You can go to heaven and live with God the Father. And all of the non-boring, interesting people were frying in hell. And you're in heaven with, the choir and Sunday school teachers, no offense. But I mean, that was kind of it. And then if you weren't a Christian, then you were damned. You went through this many rings of hell, that kind of thing. With the rise of what we call orange altitude, the orange rational achievement, progress, formal operational cognition, that really marked a dramatic shift in terms of how we organize society. And so even though, of course, we had enormous influences from the past, and many of those would stay, There were also a lot of emergent items that came with it. And it became really, really clear that you could progress into those new values, or you could conserve the values that were present. And the new progressive values were really obvious and had a profound impact. So they were, for example, universal rights versus ethnocentric rights. So not your rights as a Christian, but what rights do you have to both Christians and non-Christians? Do they equally have? Simply because they're human beings. That was a radically new notion of value. We really didn't see that kind of thing before. So that was one thing that you could progress into that value. And it seemed a higher, more inclusive moral structure to most people.
Right.
There was a switch between modern science and mythic religion. And so it was, most of the conservatives believed in the traditional dogmatic Christian religion. They didn't question it. And yet modern science came in and said, we don't believe any of that. And that caused an enormous split. And another example of what progressive values meant. There was democracy versus monarchy.
Mm-hmm.
And so the conservatives tended to support the king or queen and the aristocracy and the traditional values of that culture. And the new orange, rational left orientation tended to go for democracy. And of course, we had the French and American revolutions and so on. And likewise, slavery versus individual rights and freedom. And all of these were values that came into existence with progressives. And those were always values that at least a certain type of individual who's got a fair amount of development would always find appealing and attractive. And it just so happened, and we'll come back to this in our next topic, which is altitude. Mm-hmm. But very briefly, what we had was in the French Assembly of the 1700s, the traditional conservative believers just happened to sit in the right-hand seats of the French Assembly. And this newfangled orange liberal scientific contingent sat in the left-hand seats. And so they often just call them left and right. And by the way, when I discuss the characteristics of left and right, I don't automatically mean Democrat and Republican. The Democrat and Republicans are actual specific parties that at different times in their history have had different mixtures of left and right principles guiding them. And so it's just not true that the Democrats were always left and always liberal. They weren't. And the Republicans, who now today get identified a little bit more with nationalism, subtle types of racism or sexism or ethnocentric drives, that also wasn't always the case for what we call Republicans. So we have to be careful about that. But what I'm tracking is left and right, and which we also, and also use the term liberal and show that liberal and left aren't the same. The left started out liberal, but then the new green left became illiberal, which is a real problem. Progressive as an actual orientation started to be understood as an orientation you could take if you find any of those values good. And this was the first time when we really had this kind of strong difference presented to human beings. And those really did define the major political parties for the next couple hundred years, all the way up until the 60s, when a new level started to emerge, and that threw all of those into chaos. And we'll get to that briefly when we discuss altitude.
Beautiful. So and which is the next major scale, and actually the final major scale that you present in this ebook.
Yeah,
altitude. So obviously altitude is another thing that we've spent a lot of time talking about in previous episodes, even a lot of time in this episode so far. So we probably don't need to spend a whole lot of time on it. Plus, I want to make sure we can get through all these other minor scales into the 3 questions at the end. But that said, it is incredibly important to the conversation.
And part of the problem is that it's really not getting any attention.
Oh, none.
Any expert at all. I mean,
Nope.
which is really alarming.
Yep.
Because the evidence is that this is, in many cases, this is the strongest determinant of all these factors that can determine whether you're left or right. This turns out to be one of the very, very strongest and one of the most important. And it comes down to if we look at, the 3 major value levels that have the most impact on political orientations are, again, there are 3 of them: amber, ethnocentric, and then orange, world-centric liberty, and then green, world-centric equality. And all 3 of these are very, very different. And those 3 are essentially the 3 most recently emerged major levels or stages of development. And those 3 values are at each other's throats. And that battle is exactly what we call the culture wars. It's these 3 value systems fighting viciously with each other. And part of the difficulty in particular, and this is why we see the Democrats essentially going slightly insane as they try to figure out just what they're representing. Because they started, or at least the left started, as we said, with the emergence of orange several hundred years ago. And that new philosophy that emerged at that time was given a very specific name. It was called liberalism. And liberalism meant individual rights, individual freedom, universal rights of all human beings. That orientation itself also began all of the liberation movements because it had values of universal rights and universal freedom. And this freedom meant equal opportunity. And because we'll see that there are 2 different meanings of equality, and they're actually diametrically opposed. They're actually contradictory. And we don't know that. And that's causing an enormous number of nightmares. And I'll get to that very, very quickly. But we had these 2 essential orientations. One was progressive and liberal and orange, and one was amber and traditional and conservative and tended still to be ethnocentric. So those were the 2 major political parties until the 60s. And in the 60s, green, multicultural, pluralistic relativism started to emerge. And that changed everything. They had a completely different set of values. They had a completely different set of needs and drives. And although they arose because they were progressives, they arose within essentially the Democratic Party. the two branches of the Democratic Party, the old leftists, which were liberal, and the new leftists, which were green, illiberal.
Mm-hmm.
And so an orange, traditional liberal believed in free speech, for example. It was sort of one of the top values that they maintained. And you really couldn't have other values unless you have free speech. Well, green came along, and since these are all first tier structures, green doesn't like orange. Orange doesn't like green. And they disagree with each other sharply. So where orange is an avid supporter of free speech, green doesn't really like free speech. It's perfectly willing to suspend free speech if it's going to hurt the feelings of any oppressed minority. And so that's become a major, major issue. And some 40% of millennials, for example, in a recent poll, said they were perfectly fine with the government clamping down on free speech in order to stop offensive hate speech from getting out, even though the Supreme Court's been very clear that hate speech is covered under the First Amendment. So it's a real problem. And part of the problem is also that both orange and green believe in equality. But what they mean by equality is very, very, very different. Orange means equal opportunity. And so for orange, if you're going to have something like an Olympic 100-meter dash, that equality for doing that means that everybody who's qualified to run the race gets to run the race. Nobody's excluded because of race or color or sex or creed or gender or creed, none of that. So all of those oppressive forces are taken out, and everybody qualified to run in the race gets to run in the race. Then you fire the gun, whoever comes across the line first gets a gold medal, and then the next person gets a silver medal, the next person gets a bronze medal, and that's how that's done. Green's idea of equality is equal outcome. That's completely different from equal opportunity. Equal outcome means in the 100-meter dash, for example, that not only should everybody start fairly and at the same time, everybody should finish at the same time. In other words, everybody gets a gold medal. And this is not as funny as it might sound. There's all sorts of sporting events run by millennials and parents and postmodern teachers and parents would have baseball games, for example, where there were no winners. You simply keep playing the game, and everybody who played the game got the same participation medal. So there's no gold, silver, bronze. Everybody gets a gold medal. And that's equal outcome. And there are problems with that, to put it mildly. One of the ways that these two different types of equality are often talked about is equal opportunity is often referred to simply as freedom, because that's what it's, in a sense, amounts to, is you're free to engage in any of these activities. You're not being oppressed. You're not being held back. There are no trumped up voter registration issues that's going to stop you from voting or anything like that. So you have freedom if you have certifiable equal opportunity. And so that's their form of equality. And again, it's often just called freedom because that's what it represents. Equal outcome is often called just straight equality, because that's what it actually means, is that everybody finishes the race at exactly the same time. Mm-hmm. There are no superior or inferior values at all.
Mm-hmm.
So this is a radical egalitarianism.
Right. And equity.
Nobody is better. Nobody is worse. And so I think Alex de Tocqueville was the first to point out that you can have freedom or you can have equality, but you can't have both. And you can't, because all people are born with different capacities. Then you're either going to let them express those capacities to their full extent with equal opportunity. If that happens, different people are going to finish the race at a different time. There's not going to be a strict equality if that's what you do. On the other hand, if you want everybody to finish the race at the same time, then you have to fiddle with freedom. You have to do things. Talented people have to somehow be slowed down or held back. Or if you're an Ivy League college and you're selecting people that you'll let in, and you want more of one race than another, then you'll alter the weight you give to their SAT scores. And this, of course, happens all the time. And it's generally Asians are handicapped the most, then white Caucasians, then Hispanics, then Blacks. And there's actually a class action lawsuit against Harvard right now by a group of Asians, claiming that their freedom is being curtailed because their scores are being counted with much less weight as a similar score from another ethnicity. And so that's unfair in terms of equal opportunity, and it is. But the point is, you can't get equality without fiddling with freedom. And so when people say, oh, I'm all for equality, you have to go, okay, which equality do you mean?
Right.
Equal opportunity or equal outcome? Because they really aren't the same. Now, both need to be incorporated. So, for example, in 1970, the percentage of college degrees that were given to men got about 61% of all college degrees. Women got about 39%. Now, that's a very unequal outcome.
Mm-hmm.
And we felt that was so unfair, just based on the equal outcome, the lack of equal outcome, that the United States began a very aggressive series of social programs to help women come into these classes. And no help was extended to men. By 2015, those numbers had literally reversed. And now today, 61% of all college degrees go to women. And this includes there are more women in medicine, more women in law, and so on. So 61% of college degrees today go to women, and only 39% go to men. So some people have felt that it's gone too far, that sort of we overshot, particularly for trying for equal outcome. It's supposed to be 50-50.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't 50-50 at the start. That's why we changed it. But now it's shot way past, and we don't have equal outcome at all anyway. But the point is, we do take equal outcome seriously. And so some of the people that argue for the real importance of equal opportunity, they don't like equal outcome at all, and will argue that it's a disaster and we shouldn't have any of it. But that's not exactly true. Again, you really do have to balance these things.
Yep.
But you do want to take them both into account. And one of the problems, for example, let's say with an extreme feminist view, is that they really do want all professions to be 50%, 50%, exactly half men, half women. And if it's not, then they claim discrimination and oppression.
Mm-hmm.
Even though with women getting 61% of the degrees now, they're not accusing them of oppression, even though they're way more than 50%.
Yeah.
So that's why there are books like, with titles like The War Against Boys, or Warren Farrell's The Boy Crisis. We've tried to point out that this has just gone a little bit too far.
Yep.
The point here is that both of those really are important, but we really do have to understand the differences between those two types of equality. So when we say we want equality for men and women, nobody ever says, what type of equality do you mean? Do you want equal opportunity or equal outcome? Because that really makes a difference. And it's pretty clear, even from what a lot of the feminists want, that they don't really want equal outcome. In Scandinavia, for example, that have radically egalitarian cultures, at least the most egalitarian cultures that we have so far. And the claim of the social constructivists was that as we got more culturally egalitarian, that the differences between men and women would disappear. But in Scandinavia, in fact, the temperamental measurements of men and women have gotten greater. And the reason is when culture isn't there as a force, all that's left are some of these biological differences, and then they really show up dramatically. So in professions like nursing, the ratio of women to men is 20-1. That's huge. In engineering, the ratio of men to women is 20-1. That's huge. That shouldn't have happened. The social constructivists maintain those should be about 50-50
Right.
now, but they're just getting greater and greater as they express what seem to be some genuine different interests that men and women display.
Yep.
So one of the reasons we want to balance equal opportunity and equal outcome is to allow any of these differences that are there. I mean, I don't think we really want to go in, for example, in Scandinavia and say, okay, you nurses, a 20-1 thing, that's got to go. So 15 of you are out, and we're going to get, 10 men, 10 women, and that's it.
Right.
That's going to hurt women. It's going to really hurt men.
And we're going to take those nurses and put them in the coal mine so that we have 50-50 representation in the coal mine too. I don't see a lot of feminists pushing for that.
No. You don't see a lot of feminists mentioning coal mine. I mean, you don't see a lot of feminists complaining, for example, that there aren't more women lumberjacks.
Right.
Or more women roofers.
Yep.
So we want to be careful about that, because just these simple statements about we want equality of sexes or anything like that, we really have to be careful what we mean. Because they're incredibly different scales, and most people don't realize that.
Yeah, Ken, I think that's massively important, how, a word like equality can get interpreted so differently from altitude. In fact, I think that every single one of these other major and minor scales gets interpreted and expressed very differently at each altitude.
Oh, absolutely.
So collective responsibilities versus individual, that means something different at amber than it does at orange and green and teal and turquoise.
It's one of the reasons that the levels component does seem to be one of the most important of the scales. And it's certainly one that absolutely needs to be taken into account. And the problem is that in most Western cultures, we're not even allowed to discuss that dimension. It's just not allowed. It's off the table. And that's a real problem, because so much of increasing our interior and truly inclusive awareness rests on understanding these stages of increasing inclusiveness. So what's so unfortunate is that we have these social justice activists arguing for green, values, but they weren't born with those values.
Right.
I mean, 3 months out of the womb, they weren't, picketing and protesting and saying, we want absolute equality and all of that. They learned them through a process of growth and development. And it took about 5 major stages of development for them to get those values. That stage is the only stage that values those types of qualities. And so they're not aware of that at all. They keep pushing those values, which are very high values and we can support in a lot of ways, but they're undercutting the very path to get to those values because they trash all hierarchies.
That's right.
And so they're trashing the actual path to their own values.
Yep.
That's just disastrous.
Yep.
They don't quite seem to get that. So
yep.
That's a real problem. And it is cutting out one of the most important parameters we have, which is degree of interior growth and development.
Yep. Yeah, and things get real problematic too, Ken, when we've had multiple decades, multiple generations of green thinking whose aim is to actually deconstruct amber itself wherever and whenever it sees it. And what that does is it actually seizes the entire spiral of development. It actually breaks down the conveyor belt. And amber actually, when it gets deconstructed and it gets marginalized, it's that much easier at the amber level for different types of radicalization to take effect, for different, sort of toxic expressions of amber to come into play, because this is no longer recognized as an important stepping stone in human evolution.
Right.
And that causes all sorts of violence and struggles and suffering and all of that.
Right. And this is something that we'll briefly mention with a minor variable of states and stations and stages, because we do have to include all of these stations, even if we govern from the higher stages.
Yep.
Doesn't mean these stations have gone away. They haven't.
Right.
And any enlightened society still has to deal with the populations at those levels of development that have become stations in life. And we can't just trash them. And that's one of the worst nightmares of what just a blanket deconstruction does. It just hates all values and pronounces its own values as the one and only true real ones, then has no understanding of how those values got there and no understanding of the things that they just threw away. Those were stages to their own values.
Right.
And they just killed them. So they just pull the ladder out from under themselves and they're happy.
Yep.
Until they crash, which they are, and then they can't figure it out.
Yep.
So.
Yep. All right. Well, those were the major scales of integral politics. So let's now I'm aware of the time. We're coming up to 2 hours, and I want to get through as much of this as possible.
Okay.
So let's maybe, slam out some of these minor scales, add a few comments, and then we'll get to some of the questions at the end. So the next minor scale is agency versus communion. And one of the interesting things I think about the minor scales in general is all of them feel like, I use the word
walk versus talk.
I'm sorry?
Walk versus talk.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I skipped one. Thank you. But yeah, as I was saying, it seems like each of these minor scales is sort of a harmonic coming from some of these major scales. There's a relationship oftentimes, and it's not a one-to-one.
Yeah, they're offering just a tweak of these major scales. And that's why all of these, except I would say the regulator, are really sort of tweaks on the previous ones. And that's why I didn't include these in the major values. The major ones are the most centrally important. Mm-hmm. But then these are little tweaks that you can think about as you're going through them, because it turns out that there are just some sort of subdivisions that you can make, and being aware of those can help you make selections about the major.
Right. So the first of the minor scales is indeed lines, and you suggest that the most important lines here are walk and talk. These are two particularly important lines to focus on. Just wonder if you could say some more about that. Is this a scale in and of itself, or is it a subset of the altitude scale? It feels kind of halfway between.
Well, it's measuring different lines and the different developmental levels that they go through. And particularly when they don't match up, things can get problematic. We see this in individuals where they say one thing and yet they walk another. Their walk and their talk just don't match. And so they can often have sort of a lot of ideal values or beliefs that they'll state, but they're not really following them themselves very well. They're actually walking from a different level, usually a stage or two lower. And that's really where their heart is, even though their head is chatting these higher beliefs. It can be a greater or lesser problem, depending on how strongly it is, how severe it is, which values are involved. Certainly something like Nazi doctors, I always give that as an example. They have high cognitive development and low moral development. So their talk could often be idealistic, but their walk was just brutally immoral. Again, you see that in individuals, but you can see it in governments. Mikhail Baryshnikov, one of the maybe one or two greatest ballet dancers in history, he escaped the Soviet Union and came to live in the West. And at one point they asked him, what was the problem, the biggest problem you felt with the Soviet Union? And he thought and he said, oh, you have to lie daily. And that's just a horrifying, because they talk one thing, you know, brotherhood of humanity and all of that, but their walk is at a much, much lower altitude. And frequently, for example, a lot of the great Marxist writers were writing from green, and they wanted this pluralistic, unified, egalitarian culture where all the means of production were owned by all of the workers. So everybody was involved in the wealth, and it was split fairly and equitably and so on. But then their walk turned out to be absolutely brutal. Alexander Solzhenitsyn in the Gulag Archipelago, well, before I say it, by contrast, Hitler in his death camps murdered about 13 million people, including about 7 million gypsies, gays, intellectuals, political prisoners, and so on, and about 6 million Jews. But just 13 million flat out murders. Alexander Solzhenitsyn estimated that the Gulag Archipelago in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959 murdered about 66 million people. And he estimated that Mao's Cultural Revolution murdered about 100 million. And so that's what happens when the left goes too far. That's what it looks like.
Yep. Particularly at the amber level.
Well, that was part of the problem. But it was driven by this absolutizing of green values, which was absolutizing diversity and equality and egalitarianism, and not a unity in diversity, just diversity for its own sake, or that's what was claimed. And so what you can't have when you have something like that, you can't have anybody who's excelling or is superior to anybody else. It really does have to be equal outcome across the board, because equality really is being absolutized. And one of the problems, whenever you absolutize your belief, and this can happen with any belief, no matter what level, there are scientists that absolutize their belief in science. We call them scientism. There are feminists that absolutize their belief in feminism. Clare Graves named amber, orange, and green. He gave them the names absolutistic, then multiplistic, and then relativistic. So absolutistic was you believe, to your point of view, absolutely, it can't be challenged. It's often the word of God. Everything in the Bible is 100% absolutely true. And any fundamentalism ends up, if it doesn't start at that amber absolutistic stage, it'll often regress there. Then the orange stage added a third person rational perspective. And so it realized that there could be multiplistic perspectives, multiple perspectives, not just the one that was absolute and only, but you could have a multiple set of perspectives. And so that's one of the things that helped give rise to modern science, and also the liberation movements from abolition to the suffragettes, and also the rise of modern science and so on. And then green, he called relativistic, because then it actually sort of cut loose any way to make any distinction between any of these cultural systems that it was seeing. And so by default, it just proclaimed all of them radically equal. So it just comes up with an egalitarianism in measure, because it doesn't have enough cognitive development to actually integrate all of the differentiations that it's making. That integration starts at second tier. And that's why it's called second tier, is it can start to integrate all of those differentiations. And so second tier will start to prioritize. It will actually see growth hierarchies. It will understand how, yes, you do have more inclusive systems, and those are good, but those are the products of 5 or 6 stages of development.
Right.
You find inclusive systems way down here. And by the way, the only people that want to use dominator hierarchies are people at low stages of growth hierarchies. Right. And when you get to a high stage of growth hierarchy, one of the most common things you do is attack dominator hierarchies. So by mushing those together and ditching them all, it was a true disaster. So that type of orientation is such that if you have a belief system, and again, no matter what higher stage it comes from, if you start absolutizing it in a just really zealot fashion, then you tend to regress to the absolutistic level.
Yep.
That's what feels right when it's there. That's how the world looks to you, and you end up drawn there. And that's one of the problems. We'll get to the regression scale, and I'll bring this up again just very briefly. But one of the problems that we're having in the recent culture wars is that green, which is coming from a higher level than orange, and its multiculturalism is a move towards a greater inclusivity. But it gets so zealous and so absolutistic, and especially with its identity politics, that it ends up regressing to amber. And so what you have on amber then are, first of all, the folks that are just passing through for the first time. And so if they're Christian, they tend to be fundamentalist Christians, and they believe every word in the Bible. They can be racist, they can be sexist, whatever their ethnocentric prejudice is. So real white supremacists, they're at amber. The problem is, now we've got green regressed to amber. They're believing in identity politics, which is a form of retribalization. White supremacists believe in identity politics.
Yep.
They say, oh, you guys believe in identity politics? So do I.
Yep.
Who thought? I happen to think white folks are the best. You guys think the other ones are, but we all agree identity politics is for real. So let's fight. And that's exactly what you get open to. Because when you do identity politics, all you do is talk about how your tribe is different from another tribe.
Yeah.
Never talk about what your tribe has in common with all tribes. Therefore, you are automatically hooked into ethnocentric and you're shoving away world-centric.
Yep.
In other words, you're regressing.
Yep.
And that's the disaster of our culture wars.
Mm.
So that's one of the real problems that we have here. And so looking at some of these variables like regression and like absolutizing, at least we can start to get a handle on what's happening. And then also the ways that they're using equality to mean very different things and how we have to track that, because otherwise they, both say they're for equality, but they each mean something extremely different and they're actually contradictory. So
yeah. Awesome point, Ken.
I'm not aware of that.
Right. No, and I love this conversation about identity politics too. I had just written on Facebook a couple of days ago, right after the midterm election, I think something interesting happened. Jared Polis won as Democratic governor of Colorado. Right. The funny thing was, the day after he won, all the headlines were, America elects its first male gay governor. Right. So the identity politics were coming out in full force. The funny thing is, when I was looking at all the forums from all the people who either voted for him or did not vote for him, the number one thing I kept seeing repeated over and over again was, wait, he's gay? Oh, cool. Like it didn't like the identity politics didn't factor into the buildup to the election, but it became one way to interpret the election once it already happened. And I saw that as a healthy use of identity politics because, Jonathan Haidt, who we talked about earlier, he oftentimes talks about how, when he went to liberal arts school, and I think it was the 80s, he says, he was taught a wide selection of different lenses that he could put on one at a time to enact reality and see, look at things from different perspectives. And all of those lenses were useful insofar as they went. The problem comes when we only choose one of those lenses as being the primary lens that we're enacting reality through. And this has become the problem with identity politics. I think it's completely fine after someone like Polis wins to write a headline acknowledging the fact that he's the first male gay governor. I think that's cool because I think there are groups of people out there who have a history of oppression and marginalization, and this is a sign because talk about the starting line and the finish line of the race. Jared Polis was an example of someone who made it over the finish line. There was an equitable result here, and hey, guys, that's good news for gay America. There's a good reason to celebrate here, but acknowledge it and then let it go because there's so many more important facets to this story, including his policies, all of that. So I was encouraged when I saw that story as being like, well, here's a case where identity politics could have dominated the build up to the election, but they really only came into play after the election as sort of an interpretive device for the election. And I thought that was fine. I thought that was healthy because we didn't get stuck on it.
Identity politics is important in a developmental sense, because again, just using the very simplified, broad ways of development from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integral, everybody goes through those ethnocentric stages. Everybody goes through an identity politics stage. And they're absolutely crucial for personality formation. It's something that has to be kept in mind as we move towards global world federation, that we still have to have people develop their identities. And so there's still some role for nation states to help get them from ethnocentric towards world-centric, and then start identifying with global humanity. But we can only do these things sort of one step at a time. So these are important. What we have to be very careful about is that our identity politics recognizes that it works only if it understands it's part of a world-centric unity and diversity. It can't be just diversity. That's tribalization. That's everything humanity fought against to end bigotry and slavery. None of those got ended when we were at ethnocentric stages of development. They were all heightened on the basis of wars and serfdom and slavery and misogyny and you name it. And we got out of all of those by moving to world-centric. And if we now just start re-emphasizing identity politics, ethnocentric, we're cutting under that great world-centric umbrella of moral fairness for all. And that's a disaster. And that's part of what's happening right now. So we have to really, really be careful about that. Yeah. And the far right and the far left, neither one of those are helping. They're both sort of sucking into that identity politics, tribal orientation. Yeah. And that's really a problem. If you see it as part of an ongoing embrace of a broader identity that allows you to see what all tribes have in common and how we all should be treated fairly, regardless of race, color, sex, or creed, then it's great. Mm-hmm. And every person should be proud of their ethnic orientation, their sex, their identity, whatever it is. Right now, of course, you're allowed to be proud of any ethnic origin you have, except being a white male. So you're allowed to say, I'm proud to be gay, I'm proud to be black, I'm proud to be a woman. As soon as you say, I'm proud to be a white male, worst thing you can do. You're not allowed to say that. Yeah. You are part of the official oppressor class causing victimhood. So that's another problem with that. But aside from that, this last thing that I would say, since this is broadly under the walk and talk issue, is that in American history anyway, the first time that we got a real vicious shear between what the United States government said to us and what it actually did was the Vietnam War. Yeah. And that was historic because the government, lots of little white lies here and there and all of that. But these were what's called black truths. In other words, they sound like truths, but they're really hiding lies that are extremely malevolent. And it took something like the Pentagon Papers to let us see what the government was actually saying. And of course, it was shocking and traumatic. And polls ever since have showed Americans trust government. I mean, it just went like that. And it's never really gotten up much farther. And in recent polls, you can still find American people trust government officials slightly less than used car salesmen.
Yeah, I think gonorrhea is more popular these days.
Exactly. That's walk and talk. It's a serious issue. And even though it's just pointing to levels and lines, it's just a particular type of mismatch we can get. Yeah. And it's really important to look for. And particularly as we start to think about expanding governance to a global fashion in order to match global markets so that we get some fairness in this. That's one of the things we have to watch, because we don't want a global government that's lying.
Yeah,
That would be the biggest disaster we could think of. And that's a very serious issue. And nobody, by the way, has yet really figured that one out. So we'll see how that.
Yeah, Ken, it seems to come down to a single word, and that word is integrity. And
that's a variation on integral awareness.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's cruise on to the next line. The next major scale, which is agency versus communion.
Right.
Now, oftentimes, agency versus communion, this can mean a lot of different things. A lot of people relate to it as a typology between masculine and feminine, for example. These tend to be qualities of masculine and feminine. So there's kind of a typological thing there. I think that some people view it as, agency leans more towards the individual, communion leads more towards the collective. So here we're evoking the individual collective scale that we talked about earlier. It can even mean in certain circumstances, interior versus exterior. Interior is often seen as a more feminine kind of way to go, and looking at exterior realities can be more masculine. more empirical or what have you. So how does this scale sort of come into play?
Right. Basically, this is simply making a distinction that's important, because the dynamics of agency and communion are extremely important in an essentially universal way, because every holon has at least these four major drives.
Mm-hmm.
And so on a particular level, so if you're looking at levels of complexity, for example, then on a particular level, holon has an agency drive and it has a communion drive. The agency drive is the drive to be its own wholeness, so its own autonomy, its own self-sense. And the more it can be autonomous, then the more whole it is. And its right to, well, have individual rights are based on the fact that it's a whole.
Mm.
So as a whole, it's an agency, and as an agency, it has rights.
Mm-hmm.
But all of these holons are also parts of larger wholes. Now, in their partness, they are striving for relationship and communion. And here they don't have rights, they have responsibilities.
Mm.
So rights and responsibilities. And if any one of those breaks down, the holons will collapse because it's just broken. And so we see agency and communion occurring in every holon, going all the way back to the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
And then there are also different levels of complexity, and a holon can move up or down those levels. It can move vertically in addition to its horizontal agency and communion. So when it moves up to a higher level of holons, then we call that eros.
Mm-hmm.
And when it either embraces the present or reaches down and includes the lower subholons, that's agape. So eros is the lower reaching up for the higher, and agape is the higher embracing the lower. So these are four drives that all holons have. Now, it also just happens that as these holons develop, we do find major dimensions that are occurring that these holons are developing in. One is they have an interior and they have an exterior, and they all do. They all have prehension, and they all have exterior mass or energy forms. They have left hand and right hand quadrants. And they all exist in individual and in collective holons. And so individual and collective sometimes sounds like agency and communion, but that's not technically right.
Right.
It's just, what we're doing is just taking holons and noticing that they have these two streams of development. One is individual, and again, that's the one that has a dominant monad, and therefore, like the dog, when it gets up and walks, all of its holons go with it. That's an individual holon. Collective holons, the dog has, well, first of all, it has a family. It exists in a community of other dogs, along with communities of humans, and then broader ecological spheres that exist in biospheres, and so on. And those are all communions, and they have responsibilities that they have to perform in each of those communions if that collective is going to live. And if the collective dies, they die. So these are all greatly interwoven. But we look at upper quadrants that are all individual holons, interiors and exteriors, and we look at lower quadrants that are all collective interiors and exteriors. Every aspect of each one of those in all four quadrants has holons that have all four drives. So even the dog as an individual, within it has tissue systems that are collective groups of similar cells, and those tissue systems interact with other tissue systems. They're wholes that are parts of an endocrine system or a muscular system or a nervous system or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
If you go down, each of the cells in a tissue has subcellular organelles. It has molecules. So that whole has parts. That whole is a part of a larger whole, and so on. So you find agency and communion in every holon, in every quadrant. So they're not the same. And one of the reasons that we'll sometimes just remind people of that is, first of all, it's just something you don't want to confuse, because one of the things that you're looking at with holons is there are some things that you want to study that all holons have in common. And so that would mean holons in all 4 quadrants. And they all have those 4 major drives and so on. And then in some cases, you just want to focus on a particular drive. So if you take a political orientation, for example, one of the things that will tend to define, let's say, a really hardcore libertarian is that they really believe in agency and they really don't believe in communion. They really think that they are just free. They can do whatever they want. They don't have any constraints, and any constraints that they have are wrong, are bad, are immoral. But that's simply overlooking the inherent integral structure of the entire universe. Every agency is an agency in communion.
Yeah.
And so you can't just say, I mean, somebody who believes in just agency, they'll say things like taxes are theft, because they think that if they produce something, that they own all of it because it's their labor. And then if somebody forces them to give up some of their money to some other cause, including the state, that it's theft. They're being stolen from. And so what they're overlooking is just the intrinsic connectedness that their agency has with other agencies. And yes, you can put more emphasis on agency and less on communion. There are other political systems that put more emphasis on communion, like communitarians or communists or socialists. But that's just a way to track those. It will sometimes carry over into libertarians are just embracing individual holons and don't like collective holons. And again, that's similar-ish, but a true libertarian will adjust every single one of their actions, even in their individual behavior, to favor agency. And so they're not really even looking at collective holons. So it's a minor distinction. It's put in there more just so people understand the difference between these two, because they really are fundamentally different types of processes, and it's not good to confuse those. And yeah, that was the major point I wanted to make about that. Again, that's a clearly minor tweak, but philosophically it's important.
Well, yeah, and it feels like, Ken, also a really important guardrail for those of us who are trying to be more integral in how we engage with our political systems, because it's a reminder that, you know, look, and this is true for all of these polarities. If your political identity depends, you know, primarily on any one of these poles, you're probably doing something wrong, because I think there's something about an integral approach to politics that really takes a more sort of like systems physician kind of approach to it. And we look at the pendulum, we look where the pendulum was yesterday, where it's swinging to tomorrow. And then we sort of, you know, we orient along, you know, more like what is the most fully functioning, you know, governing politics that we could possibly create together. And then that's where we can begin to use a scalpel to actually start identifying some of these, you know, little pieces. And, you know, so in one election, I might orient more, you know, in an agentic kind of way. And the very next election, I might be leaning more towards a communal kind of orientation, because that's what the pendulum requires for sort of overall systemic health at any given moment in time.
Absolutely. And one of the sort of, we had to be careful when we use the term metaphysics, because as I've argued, metaphysics tends to mean thought that doesn't have any evidence. So there's no way you can, prove it or disprove it. You just present it as a belief that makes sense of the world to you. And originally, of course, it meant metaphysical. And so in the great chain of being, almost universally, the lowest level on the great chain, if you use the Christian version of matter to body to mind to soul to spirit, matter is always on the lowest level of every great chain model in existence. And that's funny because we started to get a real different shift of matter starting with the modern Western Enlightenment. And that was that matter wasn't the lowest level, with all the others being supernatural or metaphysical. They literally had no connection with matter at all.
Right.
So they can go from life to life, or they can have out of the body experience, any of those things. But starting with the modern Western Enlightenment, increasingly was understood that, for example, if you matter, body, mind. So let's say you're at the mind level and you're doing what Piaget would call formal operational thinking. You're giving you're studying mathematics and really looking at that carefully. Well, that would be, according to the old metaphysical approaches, that's a trans-physical, metaphysical, supernatural dimension that you're plugged into. It survives matter. It's beyond matter. But what we discovered in modernity is, even when you're thinking rationally, there's a corresponding brainwave state occurring in the upper right. So there's a material correlation to this mental level. If you get up even to something like spirit and you have a satori, yes, that could be upper left for sure, but it's also leaving, it has a correlation in the right-hand material quadrants. It's also going to leave some sort of brain physiological footmark. You can't reduce one to the other. That's a disaster. But they're both real. And so all of a sudden, matter was no longer the bottom rung on the great chain. It's the exterior of every level in the great chain. And those are, of course, what we call the right-hand quadrants. And then the left-hand quadrants are those interiors. So body, mind, soul, spirit, interior, matter, correlate, matter, correlate, matter, correlate, exterior. And that changed everything. It also allowed, little side footnote, with all of the great stuff the Western Enlightenment did, because it began studying those exterior material, great interwoven systems, what John Locke called the great interlocking order, it ended up reducing all of the interiors to lower right quadrant, to just exterior material systems of interaction, like brain physiology. It didn't bother the Western Enlightenment at first when they were doing it, because according to Arthur Lovejoy, the greatest, most common concept in the Western Enlightenment was what the French philosophers called system de la nature, the great system of nature. It was a systems theory view, as we said. And again, that's what John Locke called the great interlocking order. But the second most common idea in the Western Enlightenment literally was the great chain of being.
Right.
So they felt when Kepler was just measuring planetary motion and Galileo was measuring earthly motion, and Kepler came up with the laws of planetary motion, Galileo came up with laws of terrestrial motion, and then the super genius Isaac Newton hooked them both together in his universal laws of gravity and motion. This was an example of the great interlocking universal order. Problem is, There was no living body. There was no mind. There was no soul. There was no spirit.
Right.
But that didn't bother them because they all believed in the great chain of being. So they didn't think they were hurting anything. But 100 years of that, the only thing that was left was these material interwoven systems, the lower right quadrant. And that's been called the crime of the Enlightenment because it gutted all the interiors almost accidentally. It didn't set out to do that. So we didn't get stuck with just this systems view of the world. And it's a little ironic that most of the new paradigm approaches today that use leading edge modern sciences, all they're doing is repeating the lower right quadrant interactive order. They say that they're curing us of the Western Enlightenment, but they're actually part of the disease for which they claim to be the cure. They're just repeating it, only more vocally. It's really kind of hysterical and problematic, but that's another story. So,
well, thanks for that footnote.
Yeah. States and stages?
Yeah, well, let me see here. Where are we? We just went through agency. No, the next one is actually, yeah. And this is, so here's a minor scale, which feels, you know, pretty fucking major these days, which is progression versus regression. And this is, you know, so I'll use the word again, it's sort of a harmonic of translation and transformation. So progression and regression describes two different kinds of transformation.
Right.
You know, whereas, you know, transformation and translation was more about, you know, moving forward versus, you know, let's tend to, you know, sort of the realities that already exist. This one is basically, okay, we're either going to step forward or we're going to step back. And this one really does feel like a fault line in today's politics. So, you know, just a couple comments. So again, this is describing two different kinds of transformation, an upward transformation and a downward transformation.
Right.
And we've talked many times about how we're seeing sort of a general regression on both sides of the aisle these days. We're seeing it on the left, we're seeing it on the right. And, you know, you and I have been engaging in sort of, I'll call it an ongoing unfoldment about who is sort of, you know, who takes who's being more stupid when it comes to the regression of their parties here.
It's a horse race.
It really sort of is. My overall sense, Ken, is that, however, the regression that we're seeing on the left has not yet started affecting the politicians who are representing us as much as we're seeing on the right. Now, you might have an argument there, and we don't even need to have that argument right now. But clearly, this regression is happening on both sides of the aisle to the point where we have a president today who, you know, just a few weeks ago announced, you can consider me a nationalist. And as we talked about earlier, when we're having all of these genuinely transnational issues, you know, sort of embrace, I think the 20th century taught us some fairly nasty lessons about the dangers of nationalism. And here we have the leader of the free world who is, you know, justifying this move back, this step back towards a more nationalistic politics and a more nationalistic, you know, rhetoric. And this is, you know, I think this is legitimately problematic. We just had a climate report a few weeks ago that says, you know, basically, hey guys, we've got 10 years to get this figured out. And if we don't get this figured out, if we don't find a way to, you know, start turning this battleship, we're going to start seeing some really, you know, nasty fallout as a result. So it, you know, it feels to me like where a lot of liberals are getting lost in the woods is they feel a need, and probably a, you know, a very healthy need, to resist this regression to nationalism however they can. However, they feel the need to fight fire with fire. And so their rhetoric and their politics is also regressing because we're basically just triggering each other, and we're all turning into a bunch of trolls who are, you know, lobbing memes at each other, thinking that that's going to actually make a difference in the long run. And it's really not. It's really going to make the situation so much worse. And so what do we do about that? What do we do when we're actually faced with legitimate political regression, you know, that will probably create a lot more suffering than it will
Yeah.
solve.
Yeah. It really is problematic. And one of the things that we have to realize as we look at what was happening on the interiors of humans as we were growing and developing through societal forms that embodied at first egocentric orientations, and then we moved more into ethnocentric orientations. And then with the beginning of the rise of modernity into world-centric orientations, and then eventually into sort of more integral, embracing, just as the simplest basic developmental waves that we know are there. Part of the difference between what nationality means today and what it meant 1,500 years ago, when what was called nation states were fairly common, is that a nation state tended to embody a straightforward ethnocentric principle. It was based on either a particular ethnic tribe or a group of them, a kind of super tribe, but they were all sort of united under a banner that they could all agree on. Each of them tended to have their own gods or goddesses protecting their nation state. Remember, one of the things that Socrates got put to death for was not accepting the gods of the city, the nation state, in addition to corrupting youth. And therefore he drank the hemlock. But that's sort of what that was. And then as we continued to grow and evolve in terms of our moral expansion and capacity, and we got up into world-centric stages, those are very important. And eventually those started to transform the nation state from an ethnocentric organization into an ethnocentric organization that was imbued with largely world-centric laws and moral regulations. So when we start to find the existence of nations in a modern, rational, industrial country, then they're starting to develop laws and principles that are stemming from post-conventional or universal stages of moral development. And so that's why we started to get these increasing liberation movements where all people were brought under the tent of universal fairness and equality, I mean, equal opportunity. And that was a big move. And that differentiated the modern nation from the earliest nation state that had emerged. So that nation state now is, in a sense, where the real collective crux of humanity is having trouble. Because again, what you have is a market technology that's now global. And that market still tends to drive for competitive action. And of course, there's some cooperation in it, but companies that are just cooperative and being nice aren't going to do as well in a market as those who are highly competitive. And so it does tend to select for that. And that's kind of what we're stuck with. And then that countervailing force, again, is capacity for governance. But the market is global, and the national governments are just stuck to individual nations. And that is causing this extraordinary tension between what we have to do in order to survive versus those things that are good to do, good for the environment, good for social culture, good for equality in the best sense of the word. Those aren't being selected for, and they're not going to be as long as nations have this ultimate sovereignty and they're at each other's throats in certain ways competitively. So we're right at the beginning of this long transition into something like a world federation. And something like that is going to happen because that is the simple inherent drive of Eros. Mm-hmm. And evolution from the very beginning has been winding up. It just makes greater and greater wholes. Habermas used to say, because he believed that language had a telos of mutual understanding and moral expansion. He said, well, human beings don't just stand next to each other and do nothing. I mean, they attempt to talk and have mutual understanding and expand their boundaries. And that's an inherent drive that human beings have. So that's a genuine problem. And the issue is that where a nation state is right now, just in terms of individual development, is as it's going from, well, I'll do it this way, it's going from egocentric to ethnocentric to world-centric to integral. The nation state is right there between ethnocentric and world-centric. It's still based on just you identifying with your group, but from these world-centric principles and laws. Mm-hmm. And most of our laws and governance structures stem from orange or higher stages of development. So one of the problems when we get explicitly nationalistic movements is that they really are putting an emphasis on the nationalism mm-hmm. and not so much the world-centric universal moral part. Mm-hmm. They're more concerned with just America first, for example. Yeah. And so under those circumstances, of course, that has to be done to some degree, especially given right now where we are. But when it becomes zealotly embraced, and when it becomes hyper evaluated, mm-hmm. then you do tend to get a bit of regression in that direction. And that is part of what Trump has brought. And that bit of regression is problematic because given that we already have the far right at those ethnocentric levels, and given that we are seeing some regression of green to ethnocentric, then again, all we have are these tribal differences. And when you're at a specific group identity, or if you're at a particular ethnocentric orientation, or you are hyper patriotic with a particular nation state, again, all you emphasize is how your tribe is different from that tribe, and your tribe is different from that tribe, and it's different from that tribe. You never talk about what they all have in common. And so you're all down here in a retribalized stance. And what tribes do, and I'm not talking about indigenous people, I'm talking about original tribal organizations. What they do essentially is fight. They kill each other, or they take each other's slaves. And that's the problem with tribalism. And so this is what's looking really problematic. And there isn't just an equivalency. I know when Trump said something like in Charlottesville that, you know, there were good and bad people on both sides. He said on both sides. Well, you can see how he got that in a sort of superficial way, which is that both green, extreme far leftists were regressing to amber, ethnocentric, tribal. And then the original white supremacists who were already there were coming from that. But the whole point is that green at least started a couple stages higher. I mean, it started in a world-centric atmosphere. And one of the things that's most alarming about the left nowadays, other than the fact that they're not liberal anymore, they've turned their back on orange liberal values and just emphasizing green egalitarian values, is that we used to look to the progressive left as the leader in these increasingly higher and more evolved modes of being. That's sort of what it meant to be progressive. That's sort of why you would get behind something like the civil rights movement. That's why you would get behind rational science instead of a mythic religion. That's why you would get behind individual rights instead of slavery. And that's what progressive meant. It was the noblest, the most moral. Now to have it sort of go off the rail and not only just give a broken version of green, but to start regressing in some ways to an absolutistic amber, you don't expect that from the left, from progressives. They're the ones that were overcoming that. And now they're becoming its greatest champions. That's scary.
Yep.
That's what's frightening. You expect it from the far right. That's what somebody does there. You don't expect it from the left. I don't care how far and extreme and goofy it gets. You really hope not to wake up and find yourself as a progressive left sitting right next door to a KKK neo-Nazi. But that's where their inherent moral identity structure is. And the left didn't start there. Again, it started very high, world-centric, pluralistic. But it slipped and fell and slid down that hill. And that's a disaster. And in part, they did it because Trump is such a disaster that they hated him with so much hatred that they therefore got into very absolutistic stances. You can do anything you want to get rid of Trump and his followers. Anything you want. And that is regressive. That's absolutistic. That's a nightmare. That's what we have to really look at carefully.
Yeah, Ken, that was great. And you know, one of the things that was coming to me as you were talking about this is how, you know, again, this regression that we're talking about right now cannot be discussed without also bringing in these other major and minor scales. So, for example, you know, a nation state in communion results in something like the European Union. A nation state that begins to favor agency way too much, that results in Brexit. Right. And then that itself reinforces this sort of regressive step back. And it's, you know, and we should mention that this overall systemic regression that we're seeing, this isn't an American story, and it's not just a British story. We're seeing this all over the world. We're seeing this in Brazil. We're seeing this in Turkey. All over the world, we're seeing this sort of re-entrenchment of nationalism. And, you know, until the political left is able to basically sober up and offer, you know, common people a viable option, a viable alternative to this turn towards nationalism, which as of right now, they're really not. They're not making a good case. I mean, this is one of the big, you know, other diseases of liberalism is they never stand by their own values and their own virtues. Right. So why did Obama take such a big shellacking in the midterms in 2010? Because not a single Democrat stood behind the Affordable Care Act, and they allowed the other side to define the issue for them. And they operated underneath that framework that was given to them by the opposing party. I think we're seeing the same thing right now, where we have all these, you know, we call them social justice warriors and all that. And let me just say, there is nothing wrong with fighting for social justice. But, you know, it becomes sort of a meme when it becomes so short-sighted. And these people are actually enacting strategies and tactics that is preventing progress. It's not encouraging progress because all of them, you know, they have this self-identity of like, I'm living in 1939 and I'm stopping Adolf Hitler from emerging. And, you know, I'm sorry, Donald Trump is not Adolf Hitler. Donald Trump is Donald Trump. And you can have your own issues with Donald Trump. And, you know, let me just say for my own part, I absolutely do not hate Donald Trump. I hate Donald Trump as the president of the United States, right? I hate Donald Trump in that role. I hate this fact that we're living with right now, but I don't hate Donald Trump as a human being. And I actually think that's an important sort of discernment that a lot of liberals need to start taking themselves.
Right.
So let's move on to the next minor scale, which is stages and stations, which again, sounds very similar to the language we use in altitudes, but I think what's particularly important about this, Ken, is It really brings into the conversation how any solutions that come from these higher stages, if they do not benefit people at these lower stations of life, which they are completely allowed to inhabit for as long as they want to, if it's not actually having a positive impact on their lives, then once again, it's not going to be selected for. And this is, I think, a lot of the issues we run into with neoliberalism, with globalization, which again, I see as a positive force that has had a tremendously positive effect on, the world civilization, world citizens in general, but have created some issues on a local level for example, Americans living in the Rust Belt. That causes them to end up rejecting these ideas of globalization altogether. And that becomes a big problem. And I think that a lot of that really does come down to the stages and stations scale.
Yeah. And we're facing this with a really increasingly urgent and deeply, and it's deeply set in a whole bunch of problematic areas. Particularly given the fact that we don't tend to recognize interiors at all. Stages of interior development, that's not well understood. Almost no college professor knows even that there are those kinds of things, that they've been tested in over 40 different cultures, that there's some very general realities to them. And they're incredibly important, as we've seen, in everything from slavery to women's rights to the values of social justice activists. All of these are tied into the development of human interiors. And when those aren't taken into account, again, it really is like trying to solve AIDS without knowing anything about HIV. You just don't know the ingredients of what's causing the problem. And so you just keep flailing away at it, and it usually gets worse. And you get more zealot and absolutistic and tend to regress more. And it's just a vicious kind of circle. What happens is that with each, you can even think about it in terms of like 7 chakras. I mean, each chakra is a particular dimension of reality. It has particular drives and needs. It's exchanging certain types of elements with those in its environment. So you go from material to emotional, sexual, to power and effectiveness, to love, belongingness, and caring, to individual achievement and expression, up into integrated second tier and integral stages, and then up into even third tier transcendence. Those are always there. You always have those 7 chakras. What happens in development is that your self-sense, your identity, starts at the lowest and then slowly moves through these increasingly subtle energy centers. And so as you do that, your stage of development continues to go up, but each of the chakras themselves remain as structures of being, structures of existence. They're really there. And even if you think of it as like climbing a ladder, which it isn't like that, it's not that chunky and, one stage to the next, but even if you look at it like that, by the time you're up to the 7th rung, you no longer have the view from rung 1. You don't have the view from rung 2 or rung 3 or rung 4, but you have all of those rungs are still there and they're holding you up. And so those are the stations of life. Those remain. And individuals all start out at rung 1 and have to grow and develop as best they can. And they can stop almost anywhere up that spectrum. And like we said, about 60 to 70% of the world's population stops at ethnocentric or lower stages. So the rule is you have to take care of those stations. They each have different values. They each have different motivations. They each have different needs. You want to try to govern from the highest stage that you have available. But that stage has to include all of the previous stations or rungs. And so that's just a real issue. It's a fundamental issue about how we construct a society that takes into account interior realms of being. And that's absolutely central. It's crucially important. I personally think that one of the major factors for doing that is an education that allows us to be aware of that. Yeah. And one of my sort of, we have a question about kind of utopian ideals. One of mine is getting to a point where people in the culture at large can understand that everybody is in an ongoing sweep of development and evolution and so on. And it's nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed about in terms of where you are. There are always higher stages available, but we do want to be aware of that. Now, we don't have any trouble recognizing stages of development up until around age 18. In fact, almost every developed country has an educational system that has around 12 grades. Mm-hmm. And we recognize each grade includes the previous grade and then adds some new stuff, and then goes on to the next stage and includes the previous one, adds some new stuff. And nobody, if you say you're in the 8th grade, nobody, you're not ashamed or embarrassed of that. And everybody would agree, for example, that if we want a president of the United States, we want somebody that has a 12th grade education. We don't want somebody that has a 3rd grade education as president of the United States. Mm-hmm. And that's not a nasty moral judgment. That's just, no, we recognize that's a reality. We don't want a president that just has a 3rd grade level of education. That's not going to work very well.
I want a brain surgeon who went to med school.
Well, see, but all of a sudden at age 18, everything above that, absolutely equal.
Yep.
No differences.
Yep.
Don't recognize any of it. And yet almost all of the interesting, profound stages, what's actually called adult development, starts there. They don't end there, they start there. And those are all being denied. And the disaster of that is that we don't have any feedback mechanism that lets us as a society identify those people and let them participate in our governance. Because after all, if you get any developmental study, those higher stages are more loving, they're more caring, they have more perspectives that they're taking into account. These are people you want helping to govern your nation and help solve wicked problems. But if we don't acknowledge that at all, we don't have any feedback mechanism for that, we don't even acknowledge it exists, zero chance of doing that. And that's a huge nightmare. It's one of the real problems that we have in this culture. And it's aggravated by the fact that greater development in general, sort of fewer people reach those higher stages. So in terms of one person, one vote, what we're really selecting from is this massive middle-ish kind of development. Mm-hmm. And again, without getting, meaning any sort of nasty judgment, it does say, well, wait, what kind of depth and talent do you want making these decisions? Like you say, for if somebody's going to do brain surgery on you, you definitely want them to have about 8 years of education, a decent medical school, a good internship, practice it a few times, and then maybe you can cut my skull open. But without all of that, I don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
But, oh, by the way, run my country?
Yeah.
Whatever you want.
Yeah. Well, that's a
talk and brag like somebody like Trump. You're my guy. I wouldn't let that cut into my brain.
Yep.
Let alone run my country. Yep. But that's what we're doing. It's horrifying.
That's right. Yeah, Ben Carson can get, that's the other thing. Ben Carson, hey, if you want to operate on my brain, he's the guy to go to. But he's not the guy who I want leading the country. So even here, it's, again, lines of development.
What I want are, and what I see happening down the road is that these general waves of unfolding will be available. We'll know about them the same way we know about 10th grade, 11th grade, 12th grade. And it'll just be part of the feedback mechanism that we use in society. And some people, for some tasks, we might decide, I don't care how high they're developed. If they've got, a decent college education and they're at least at orange or green, I'm fine, because they seem to have the skills. Otherwise, they have a lot of integrity. They seem very honest. I like that person. I'm going to go with that. That would be fine. It's just having this as a feedback mechanism that includes the chance to take advantage of greater development that's producing more love, more care, more perspectives, more awareness, more consciousness. Have that available as part of the choices that I get to make. Yeah. And without having that, that's a cultural disaster of the first magnitude.
Yeah, Ken, that sounds like one of the only viable paths out of the sort of anti-intellectualism that we see so prominently in our culture, and again, on both sides, and the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? Where the least among us actually think that we're the highest among us, where, people have a hard time identifying information that's literally over their own heads.
Right.
So therefore, there is nothing over my head. And it results in this sort of, lower development arrogance that ends up causing more problems than it solves.
Yep.
All right. Well, let's get to the final minor scale here. And this is, for my reading anyway, probably the most mysterious of the scales, because I've never seen you mention anything like it before. And that's something you call the regulator.
Right.
Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah. Any collective of human beings, even collectives of higher animals, they have to make certain decisions about what to do as a group. Mm-hmm. And because of that, they need some type of self-regulating agency. And from the very beginning of the earliest tribes, maybe close to 1 million years ago, we have had various forms of governing organizations or institutions. And it's gone from, we have anarchy to chiefs, emperors, czars, monarchy, aristocracy, democracy, socialism, communism. They face different kinds of issues. They have to deal with things like their walk and talk. A large part of it will also be how much of this education is made available, so that in the future, just how much of the higher stages of development will we have available as feedback to make decisions. All of these are important. Another really crucial item we talked about earlier with the globalization of markets, but not yet the globalization of governance. And so with governance being something that can put a moral restraint on markets, like governments saying, okay, you can't sell human beings in a free market, not allowed. You can't sell drugs in a free market, not allowed. And these types of things. We end up looking to the regulator to help adjust moral issues in society. That's a difficult thing to do. It's very easy to do wrong. But like I say, the civil rights movement in the 60s made that type of action. There was very clearly cases for that type of action was beneficial, good, and needed. And just that happened at about the same time that the negative view of regulators with the Vietnam War and the distrust of government also came into being. So we recognize both of those, and both of those are issues. But there's also this underlying drive of Eros, which is driving eventually to some sort of world federation. And that'll have an entirely different set of issues. One of them won't be determining how to handle, let's say, carbon emissions worldwide. But globalization is an issue for our governance structures right now. And because part of the difficulties with globalization is that it is causing massive sort of economic redistribution around the world, then that's causing a fair number of citizens and individuals in various countries to start this type of nationalistic pushback that, wait a minute, if this is nationalism, is me losing my job and my standard of living going down, et cetera, I don't want globalization. And the number of people that are making a fortune from globalization is relatively small. There's now something horrifying. It used to be 8, then it was 7, then it was 6. And I think I just saw one that said 5. But 5 human beings on the planet now own 50% of the wealth. 50%. It's alarming. I mean, that starts to become something approaching evil.
Yeah.
And I generally don't have quite, I have concern, real concern, but I don't have quite as much concern about some types of inequality in wealth, because I don't think that if somebody's in a room and they have $5 and you have $1, that they stole the money from you. Whatever they did to earn it simply brings it into being. I don't think it sucks it out of somebody else automatically and always. In some cases it does. We have to look at that very carefully. And wealth inequality is a serious problem. But when it gets to the point of a half dozen people owning half the wealth on the planet, something about that is horrifying. Yeah. Especially since there are some really major problems that could be cured if we simply took half of that away from them. Yeah. But those are fraught issues. I recognize people, even integral thinking people can reasonably disagree on those issues.
Did you hear that, everyone? Ken Wilber says, get your pitchfork.
Yeah. One of the things that keeps this going has been addressed by a gentleman named John Bunzl, B-U-N-Z-L, and he's created a system called simultaneous policy. And I think this is a very intelligent, even sort of clever, in a good sense, proposal. I'm not sure exactly how far it will go, but I think it's a fantastic beginning. And that is what's called SIMPOL for simultaneous policy, is that individuals in countries, and it can also include particularly government officials, are invited to sign a pledge that as soon as a significant number of other politicians and citizens in other countries have signed this pledge, then the policies will go into effect on the same day, at the same time, and apply to everybody. Now, the reasoning behind this is that the way we've got it set up now, when we have a global market and only national governments, is that in order for governments to survive, they have to be economically competitive. And that means that if a nation does something for the global good, but it's penalized economically for doing that, because say it would cost them a lot of money to do it, they'll lose profits if they do it, but it would be the right thing to do. Well, they're exactly prevented from doing that kind of thing because they would simply get wiped out on the global market. Mm-hmm. and they end up dying, and you just can't do that. So the market itself has got this extremely competitive, in a negative sense, factors kind of locked into the world condition. And so when you sign a SIMPOL pledge, you're simply pledging that we're aiming to get a significant number of people in as many countries as possible to sign on to these pledges. And when we have enough of those, then policies that would, if only one nation did them, would economically hurt that nation, then those policies are open for a SIMPOL solution. Mm. And the solutions are gathered, and since everybody's agreed to it, then they all put them into play at the same time. And therefore, nobody is disadvantaged unfairly. Everybody faces the same downside. But then you get the positive good, whether it's for the environment or social culture or whatever the policies are. Those are put into play without disadvantaging a country economically. And so that can allow that to go forward. I think, relatively speaking, that's a very, like I say, clever, a very intelligent way to do it. It's very clear the United Nations can't do something like that now. And so this is just at least another way of approaching something like that. And I think it's at least worth looking at. And what it does tend to do is, since people signing it now, and there have been, I think in the last UK elections, they picked up 63 more politicians that signed the SIMPOL pledge. So these kinds of things are moving forward. It's being taken seriously. It's getting some good attention. But then it gets to the point where you actually have to sit down and decide on the policies that the nations will agree with. And that's usually where you run into problems, getting that kind of agreement. But in the meantime, you're only signing this agreement in principle. So people that are signing it have to be thinking about global problems and how to solve global problems. So they're plugged into world-centric and integral levels of development, or they wouldn't even be thinking that. So people that get involved in something like SIMPOL, we're selecting for the more widely developed and evolved, if you will, individuals who do have global concerns in mind. And so I think that's good. And something like that could be a help. So that's the general regulator, is just looking specifically at the fact that we have choices in how we do that. Those regulators have changed dramatically throughout history, and they've been dependent upon quadrants and levels and types, and they will continue to be. And as we start to look at those, that's one of the main factors that we'll want to take into account as we start to implement some sort of integral political solutions.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Yeah.
All right, well, Ken, I'm just looking at the time. We've been doing this for over 3 hours, but we still have these remaining questions. What do you think? Do you want to get to them now, or should we hold off on them?
Well, maybe we could do something along. I think your question number 2 was kind of a utopian.
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. Let's do that one, and maybe we'll hold the first and third question for next time. So here's the question. Based on everything we've been talking about so far, if you, Ken, were sort of philosopher king of the world, what sorts of new systems would you create? And I wanted to, offer my own sort of example here. For me, if I was king of the world, I would try to enact a system that I've been, sort of very loosely calling Maslow socialism. You can also call it Maslow capitalism because it tries to find a place for both.
Right.
But it basically means, let's actually create something like a universal basic income that essentially socializes the bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy of needs: food, water, shelter, healthcare, education, etc., and then capitalize the middle to high rungs. And then the highest rungs of self-transcendence and self-actualization, well, they can't really be touched by either of those approaches. But that's okay. I personally think that having a system like this would actually ensure that more people are able of reaching those higher rungs to begin with, because you're basically eliminating people's scarcity concerns. And imagine what this would do for something like, entrepreneurship, where you're not worried about, starting a new business or trying to enact a new idea in the world. You're not afraid of losing your health insurance and your salary and all that if you take that risk. So it seems like in a certain sense, this kind of system could actually help capitalism in a lot of ways,
right,
while also preventing people from falling through and creating economic drag. So that was my own sort of utopian project. I really want to know what yours is.
Yeah, those types of things are exactly the types of solutions that people that are looking at a complete cosmic address, that are using a complete integral approach, will start to think of, precisely because they're addressing a lot of these variables that for the most part are unheard of. Don't even know that they're for the most part. And that's just absolutely disastrous. There are a couple of factors that I can see coming into play at various times as we move forward from this nation state to this more integrated world-ish federation type of organization. One of the ones that I think is really important for right now is some sort of parliamentary system. And one of the reasons is that this two-party system really forces all of those polarities into just the crudest of, either this or that, either this or that. And then it flops down into, okay, this choice or that choice. And it's just a horrible way to do it. Especially since the whole point about these polarities is if you actually start looking at any of the great wisdom traditions, East or West, all of them are pretty unanimous that the ultimate reality is what's variously called non-dual, or a unity of opposites. The Christian mystics call it coincidentia oppositorum, the coincidence of opposites. Alan Watts actually did a book on this called The Two Hands of God. So like even ultimate reality has a left and a right. Okay. So all the opposites are actually unified. And that was Nagarjuna's big breakthrough in Mahayana Buddhism, that unlike the original Buddhist thought, nirvana isn't just separate from samsara. Nirvana and samsara are not two. That which you call emptiness is not other than form. That which you call form is not other than emptiness. These are classic examples of getting the opposites together, even though they remain opposite as well. But when you just force to clunk one or the other, nirvana or samsara, left or right, up or down, you're just guaranteed a broken system pretty much indefinitely. When we added green to the traditional amber and orange, we broke the two-party system bad. And that's a real issue. And also just in terms of how can we start to get something like an integral political party? Should we take Democrats and try to sort of move them up? It's very, very hard to take an existing political party and add a different value structure to it. The Democrats aren't doing it right now. They added green to orange, and they have an internal nightmare. They really don't know how to do that. And so they switch back and forth and back and forth. And it's just embarrassing. So a parliamentary system would allow something actually called an integral party to start. And people would be very accepting of that. And those kinds of things have a chance of getting into parliamentary systems. There is a movement that's now called the Transpartisan Movement. One of the leaders of it is a guy named Jim Turner. Jim Turner was Ralph Nader's right-hand man for a couple decades. And when Nader was writing books that were making him famous, like Unsafe at Any Speed and things like that, Jim Turner was doing a lot of that. Turner has stayed in Washington and is a well-known consultant. He's a founder of Integral Institute, and they use integral approaches in their transpartisan approach. And they're aggressively trying to develop a transpartisan political theory. And it includes understanding these general broad waves of development in terms of the different types of qualities and characteristics that will give to politicians themselves. So actually defining a little bit of a descriptive, here's somebody, an amber politician will generally have these kinds of values and qualities. And by the way, if you like that, vote for your amber person. We're not saying you can't. We're saying make this part of the feedback that you get. So that's a possibility. Something like SimPoll is another little bit of an ingredient that can help. There's something that I would sometimes refer to as a third house. There have been a fair number of integral political attempts to come up with governmental solutions that would be more integral. And the most common then is to just say something like, okay, well, we have the House and the Senate now, we'll add a House of Wisdom, and they'll all be integral and they'll be responsible for integral ideas. And we'll just add that right now, and then that will help take care of things. And the problem is, okay, how do you actually get people to agree to do something like that?
Right.
That's going to be much harder than you can imagine. One of the possibilities to kind of bridge into that is to go ahead and try adding a third house, but it would be created by individuals in both the House and the Senate voting for a relatively small handful of people that would have some fairly strong powers in terms of laws that are implemented. And the point is that the people that are voted into that third house would really be monitored strictly for a very, very high moral development and moral approach. And they would be elected to that house by the present members of the Senate and the House, with this understanding, which is kind of like a John Rawls' original position. And that is, if you're, say, a member of a House, and you know that this person you're voting for is going to have some fairly strong rights, including rights over what you do yourself as a legislature. The typical way to try to do that now would be, well, I'll try to bribe them, or, well, I'll try to find somebody that agrees with me and that will always vote the way I want it to. But if those are blocked off, and we're going to have people that are making decisions based on these just as pure a moral decision as possible, meaning as high a moral position as possible, then you're going to vote for the person that you think, since you can't influence them, you can't bribe them, you can't, but you do believe that your position is fair and true and good, then you're going to vote for a person that you think is fair, because they'll at least choose you as often as somebody else. You'll at least get some votes if your beliefs are really true. I mean, if you really do think your position is right, then somebody who is thinking clearly and morally and responsibly is going to agree with you at least some of the time. Mm-hmm. So we would get people in this third house that might not be all at integral stages, but they would be at some of the highest stages of anybody in the government, because people are automatically going to be choosing those that are going to be the most fair with them, because they're going to get stuck with it. So that kind of thing is just another sort of a type of step that can be taken to help move in that direction. One of the most important things for the future is the educational system, and getting these general ideas into the educational system in a way that really counts. One of the things that happened with Green and the postmodernists, which is good news, bad news, is that most of the institutions that a particular society has have to be fairly conservative. Because, I mean, you can't just come in and somebody says, oh, I've got a new idea for education. Oh, okay, let's just try it on this new generation. And, you know, if we screw it up, we screw it up, but we'll give it a shot, see what happens. You have to be fairly conservative about that. Same with medicine, same with law. You have to be careful to dump those things over. And so Green came in, though, and showed us that in one generation, it could take over the educational system in the Western world, pretty much top to bottom.
Yep.
I mean, there are kids in the third grade now that are being given tests to show them what white privilege is and how they have it. I mean, it's really nasty stuff. Yes, we don't want white privilege, but white privilege isn't white privilege, it's majority privilege.
Yeah, exactly.
In China, you wouldn't have white, well,
yeah.
They showed us that the educational system can be taken over by a very specific level of development in a very short amount of time. And in the 60s, all of the smart and brightest thinkers, when they were pushing the leading edge, they were pushing Green. And that's why the best and the brightest were at Green. And that's why when they looked at education, that's what they offered, Green, the education. And they got it. And it had some major problems, of course, particularly since it was often a broken Green that they used. But they did get it in there. They did make it happen. And that is an indication that it can happen again. And so when we start getting the best and brightest now are moving into integral, and we have the percentage at integral going up from about 10 years ago, it was roughly 3%. Now it's closer to 5%. When it hits 10%, that's a tipping point that will have a profound impact. And that could happen anywhere from 10 to 20 years from now. So that's a very foreseeable possibility. What's more, it might be combined with a technological singularity, and it would amount to a cultural singularity and a technological singularity, singularities in the left and the right, that together would be an extraordinary combination of factors that could really accelerate human growth and development. So there's that possibility. And so augmented human capacities is another factor that I can see helping to bring in this type of stuff. Particularly as artificial intelligence itself it continues to improve. Another factor is getting the process of waking up into our culture. We don't have that at all. Most of the popular Sunday school sort of approaches to Christianity, don't know anything about waking up. And so we just don't have that understanding in our culture, even though it's the only developmental pathways that humans have ever devised that claimed to offer a direct access and a direct first person experience of ultimate truth or ultimate reality. Science and everything else just claims relative reality, and that's right. But humans have developed a process to access an ultimate ground of all being. And yet we cut that out entirely from our culture, which is a catastrophe, again, of just a first magnitude. It's an unbelievably dim-witted approach to these things. And for individuals, the recommendation is just to continue to think differently. And that means to study any integral approaches that you like, come up with ones of your own, contribute to what those are. There's a great deal of research that's been done on these developmental stages, a great deal of research that's been done on integral ways of thinking. The amount of evidence for these things is overwhelming. Some of these models, again, have been tested in over 40 different cultures, including Amazon rainforest tribes, Australian Aborigines, Harvard professors, no major exceptions to those stages. It's really awesome. And so think differently, study those things, and then speak up. Try to, give a course if you're in education. Devise a course or two on how to think integrally and make it very practically oriented. Do a course online. Do just a video online for YouTube. Share your understanding and don't be shy about that. It should constitute a genuine integral activism. And so that's important because that's something anybody can start to do right now. There's sort of other items I could run down, but maybe we can call this to a halt for right now. And I'll end with what was truly a science fiction conception for me. I went through a period, I don't know, about 10 years ago, where I was thinking about science fiction writers. And what they were trying to do is to guess the form of an emergent future reality. Mm-hmm. And the things about an emergent reality, which means a truly novel reality, is that novel means novel. It means it's never happened anywhere before. And so usually if you can guess what an emergent might be, that's not novel enough. The whole point about emergence is you can never guess what they're going to do, and almost nobody ever does guess them. Even Nostradamus and all that, he didn't really hit things. So they're really, really hard to do. But one of the group of artists that does the most of it is science fiction writers. So I was thinking, okay, what would be a science fiction scenario that would come as close as I could think of as something outrageously off the wall, unbelievably novel that would just change things beyond conception. And I started thinking about one of the oddest items that I've noticed in development or evolution in general. And it's really kind of a strange thing. And that is evolution sort of everywhere brings greater depth, but less span. And so, for example, you have atoms going to molecules, molecules to cells. There will always be fewer molecules than atoms, always. Because molecules are made of atoms. So one molecule always has at least 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 atoms. So there's always going to be more atoms than there are molecules. And when molecules make cells, there will always be more molecules than there will be cells, because each cell has hundreds of molecules. So of course there's all, and no exceptions at all. And in cells into organisms and so on up that scale. And what it means is the greater the depth, the greater the development you get in the scale, the fewer the number of items are that make it there. And yet it's always at the leading edges that the vast majority of the really great stuff exists there, right, where the fewest number of people get it. I mean, in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and I always use this example, but there's an intergalactically huge selling religious author. And two of his books are called, one is called, Who is This God Person Anyway? And the second one is called 53 More of God's Biggest Mistakes. And to me, this development where all the good stuff gets to fewer and fewer people, that's like God's 54th mistake. It should be the other way around. Jesus Christ. So, and then when we have democracy, that's just one body, one vote. And that's likely to be, you know, not from the highest. I mean,
right.
It, like turquoise, there's 0.5% of the population. So that's not going to have much impact on democracy, even though it's the most loving, brightest, most perceptive stage we have. It's going to have the least impact on our culture. That's really screwed up. Yeah. So the idea was, what if we actually got to a point down the line where, you know, in the original Star Trek, McCoy used to put the patients on a table, and then there was these columns of light above them, and they were all at different heights, you know, representing different systems.
Yeah.
How well
you're speaking my language right now.
And I said, well, that could be like a psychograph at some point. I mean, if we could actually get it so that we could track the correlations of brain physiological states as human interiors went through their stages of development, so that we really could shoot a brain and get a fairly general but pretty accurate take on where their general center of gravity of development is. So is it magenta? Is it red? Is it amber? Is it orange? Is it green? And then, of course, if we could do it in different lines, like a real psychograph, that would be great. But just for sake of argument right now, just use those general levels of development. And now suppose that, and by the way, many developmentalists define a level of development by saying it actually adds a perspective.
Yep.
So red has just a first person perspective. It can only take its own viewpoint. Amber can take a role of other. So it takes a second person viewpoint. Orange adds a third person perspective. So it can create science and hypothetical deductive reasoning and so on, and create broad universal systems of chemistry or biology, stuff like that. And then green develops a fourth person perspective, so it can reflect on these orange universal systems. It usually ends up differentiating them into multiple, and so we have multicultural products. And then teal, first to second tier, adds a fifth person perspective, and it can actually take all those differentiations of green and weave them together into unified frameworks. So Jane Loevinger, by the way, has tracked that empirically up to seventh person perspective.
Wow.
Which is into turquoise. So what if, instead of, and you know, increasingly good stuff up here and increasingly domineering, selfish, nasty stuff down here, what if instead of one person, one vote, we had one perspective, one vote?
Right.
So red would vote and it would be counted one vote. Amber would vote, that would be 2 votes. Orange would vote, that would be 3 votes. Green, 4 votes. Teal, 5 votes. Turquoise, 6 votes. So you would actually weight the increasing goodness and perspectivism and loving, caring, kindness. And the more people had of that, the more votes they would get in terms of what we actually did. And so it's one way to actually take advantage of what development and evolution does, which is produce a greater good, greater truth, greater beauty, and yes, lots of problems as well. It's not just a sweetness and lightness thing. But that is kind of a science fiction, outrageous Tomorrowland. I'll stop on that one. It's just
no, it's a good one. What I like about that too, Ken, is because there are so many more people at the base of the pyramid, they're still going to have a voice because they've got the numbers. Even if they get only one vote per perspective.
There's tons of them.
Exactly.
Tons of them. They probably still outnumber the number of votes from turquoise. It says only 0.5% of the population, even though they counted 7 votes. This is, but it would start to equalize it.
Right.
That was the point.
Yeah, that's fun. I feel bad for whatever governing agency is responsible for assigning people to perspectives.
And that remains
I love it.
We don't know exactly what kind of brain imaging will be able to pick up these structures or not. That's still an open question.
Yeah, totally. And maybe someday it'll be an artificial intelligence overlord, and we just, hey, you control things. You're the regulator now. Well, Ken, this has been awesome. We're, over 3.5 hours into this. I feel like there's still so much to talk about. We'll pick this up again in the next episode for sure. But, as always, thank you so much for your time and for your energy. This is just so much fun. I love doing this with you.
Me too,
and thank you everyone out there for tuning in. Be sure to catch us next month in December when we pick it up again. And in the meantime, I hope everyone has a wonderful Thanksgiving. And Ken, I'll talk to you soon, buddy.
You bet, pal. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye, everyone.